Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to drift with me back to the far side of time, to the mist-shrouded villages and rice paddies of feudal Japan, where life for the common peasant was often a harsh and quiet struggle beneath the polished steel of samurai blades and the stern gaze of distant lords. In this gentle telling, we shall wander slowly through the hidden alleys of history, brushing our fingertips along the thatched roofs, the muddy paths, and the simple hearths that warmed the hearts of those who knew little comfort. This is not a tale of great battles or mighty castles, but of the countless souls who tilled the soil, bowed their heads, and tried to carve out a sliver of peace in a world that offered them little mercy. Let us begin our long, winding journey into the quiet, often brutal life of a peasant in feudal Japan. It begins at dawn, when the sky is still painted in a bruised hue of lavender and gray, and the first birds begin their cautious songs among the reeds. A single farmhouse squats at the edge of a rice paddy, its walls patched with wattle and daub, its roof heavy with straw that must be replaced each season, lest the rains soak through and rot the beams within. Inside, a family stirs. The father, Taro, rubs the sleep from his eyes with hands rough as tree bark. Beside him, his wife, Aiko, pulls a thin blanket closer around their youngest child, who whimpers against the chill. There is no hearth to speak of, only a shallow pit in the center of the floor where last night's coals have gone dull and cold. Outside, the village wakes slowly. Thin plumes of smoke begin to rise from other huts. Dogs bark softly, chasing each other down muddy paths lined with stone. Somewhere in the distance, a crow caws and takes flight, startled by the first shuffle of wooden sandals on damp earth. Taro steps out, stooping low beneath the doorway, his breath clouding in the morning air. His eyes drift to the paddies stretching before him, squares of dark, sticky mud glistening in the dawn light. In these paddies lies his entire world and all the wealth he will ever know. Taro's father tilled these same fields before him, and his father before that. Each generation carved canals to guide the water, built dikes with stones pried from the riverbanks, and bent their backs under the summer sun to coax life from the stubborn soil. Taxes loom over every stalk of rice, taxes to the village headman, to the local samurai, to the distant daimyo who will never set foot in this hamlet, yet demands his share all the same. Each year, the yield must be enough not only to feed Taro's family, but also to satisfy those who wield the swords. If the crop fails, there is no mercy. This morning, Taro trudges through the slick path between paddies, a hoe slung over his shoulder. The earth is soft with last night's rain, which means he must inspect the dikes for leaks. If water slips away, the young shoots will wither and his family's meager hopes with them. He kneels by the embankment, feeling the wet clay, pressing it back into place with calloused hands. His back aches already, a familiar throb that reminds him of all the days that came before and all the days yet to come. Meanwhile, Aiko tends to the small fire inside their home. She feeds it slivers of kindling gathered from the forest edge, a forest they are forbidden to enter freely, for the trees belong to the Lord, as does the game within. She must be careful not to let the smoke betray them should she ever gather too much. She boils a thin rice gruel, a poor meal, but enough to hush the children's stomachs for a while. Her oldest, little Kenta, eyes the pot with a hunger too large for his years. She gently taps his shoulder, reminding him that patience is a virtue even when the belly rumbles. Outside, other villagers appear, figures bent under baskets, tools and burdens unseen yet deeply felt. They exchange quiet greetings, nods more than words, before dispersing to their own strips of land. They share the same fate, tied together by invisible threads of hardship and obligation. Should one family fail, the village suffers. Should they all fail, retribution from the local magistrate is swift and merciless. The seasons govern everything. Spring brings hope as the fields are flooded and seedlings transplanted by hand, each one pressed lovingly into the mud. Summer burns the skin, the sun high and pitiless, sweat trickling down spines as peasants bend and bend and bend again. Autumn is harvest, when the entire village labors side by side to gather the rice before typhoons or pests can ruin the yield. Winter is hunger season, when the stores are thin and bellies echo like empty drums. But for now, it is spring, and Taro must work while the dawn is kind and the day still soft. He stands, wiping mud from his palms onto his trousers. He glances back at the hut where Aiko watches from the doorway, baby on her hip, eyes meeting his for a fleeting heartbeat, a silent promise that they will endure somehow together. Beyond the paddies, the road snakes toward the village center, where a small shrine perches on a rise of earth, shaded by a lone pine tree. Here the villagers come to whisper prayers to the local kami, spirits who may grant favor or look the other way as storms gather. Taro pauses before the shrine each morning, bowing low, offering a coin if he can spare it, or a handful of rice if he cannot. He murmurs a wish for strong crops, gentle rains, no fire, no flood, no visit from the tax collector until the granaries are full. As the sun climbs higher, the village hums with a quiet rhythm. Children gather sticks, mothers mend baskets, old men sit beneath the eaves, mending tools dulled by years of toil. There are no grand stories here, only 1,000 tiny labors stitched together like the thatch above their heads. By midday, Taro's shoulders ache, and the mud sucks greedily at his feet as he moves between rows, checking the chutes for pests. He thinks of the village headman, a man who rarely soils his own sandals, but who will come at season's end with a ledger and a calculating eye. He thinks, too, of the samurai who sometimes ride through, bright armor, stern faces, the cold glint of katana blades. One word from them could undo all of this. These fields, this family, this fragile thread of hope. Yet, as the sun dips again, Taro allows himself a small breath of contentment. The fields are sound, the water flows true, and tonight there will be enough gruel for everyone. In this world, that is enough. As dusk settles, the village lights its lanterns, tiny flickering stars against the vast dark. Inside the farmhouse, Aiko hums softly as she lays the children down to sleep. Taro sits cross-legged by the cold hearth, eyes heavy but mind restless. Outside, the frogs begin their song, weaving their voices into the fabric of night. And so ends this first day, one among thousands, of peasant life in feudal Japan, where each dawn brings both promise and peril, and where dreams are sown in furrows deep as sorrow itself. Dawn comes again, slow and soft, spreading pale fingers across the slumbering village. The mist clings to the paddies like a silken shroud, hiding the muddy paths that wind between huts and fields. Inside his small farmhouse, Taro blinks against the gray light filtering through cracks in the wall. He rises quietly so as not to wake the children, their small forms curled together for warmth on the thin straw mats. Aiko lies beside them, her face turned toward him even in sleep, as though she dreams of watching over him as surely as she does in waking. Outside, the air tastes of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from distant cook fires. Taro breathes it in deeply, feeling its chill settle in his chest. He pulls his woven jacket tighter around his shoulders and steps out into the soft squelch of the path. Beside the door, his hoe leans against the wall where he left it last night, still speckled with dried mud. He picks it up, weighing its familiar heft in his hands, a tool passed down from his father, its handle smoothed by decades of labor. In the hush of morning, the village seems almost peaceful, as if the burdens waiting in the fields have not yet woken. Taro walks the path that curves past other huts. He nods to old Ito, already hunched over a pile of reeds he will weave into baskets for carrying rice. Ito's fingers tremble slightly, the bones gnarled like old roots, yet his hands still move with the memory of youth. They share a quiet greeting, no words, only a dip of the head and a fleeting glance that says, "We are still here. We still endure." At the paddy's edge, the water reflects the pale sky. Small frogs scatter as Taro steps onto the embankment. He checks the narrow canals that feed each plot, watching for leaks, stray branches, anything that might steal away the precious flow. His reflection wavers in the ripples. A man not yet old, but no longer young, his eyes lined from years squinting against sun and wind. A distant shout draws his gaze up the path. It is Saburo, a neighbor, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, splattered in mud from ankle to knee. He waves, breathless from jogging down the narrow ridge between paddies. "Taro," he calls, voice muffled by the damp air. "There's trouble at the north field. Foxes again. They've torn up the dike. If we don't mend it by noon, half the seedlings will drown." Taro sighs softly but nods. He shoulders his hoe and follows Saburo along the slippery ridge. Together, they move through the maze of paddies, feet sucking at the wet clay, arms brushing against the tender shoots that sway with the slightest breeze. They reach the breach, a low section where muddy water spills over, turning the narrow footpath into a sluggish stream. The two men kneel without a word, sleeves pulled back, hands plunging into the cold muck. They press lumps of clay and straw into the gap, working in tandem, fingers numb but steady. The sun lifts slowly behind them, its warmth coaxing steam from the wet fields. Tiny insects dance above the water's surface, skimming like spirits born from the mist. As they work, Taro glances at Saburo's face, smeared with mud, brow furrowed with worry. He knows Saburo's burden too well. A wife expecting their third child, a harvest already promised in full to the village headman to pay a debt from last year's lean yield. Should the foxes ruin even a corner of the field, Saburo's children will feel that loss deep in their bones by winter's chill. When at last the dike holds, they lean back on their heels, breath misting in the warming air. Neither man smiles, but both share a quiet relief. Taro claps Saburo's shoulder lightly. No need for thanks between men who know that any kindness given today will be needed tomorrow in turn. Back at his own paddies, Taro kneels again among the young rice shoots. He moves carefully, plucking stray weeds before their roots can tangle with the crop. His back twinges with each stretch and bend, but he does not pause. Weeds do not wait for mercy, nor does hunger. The morning slips by in this steady rhythm. Pluck, pull, press, repeat, until the sun hangs high overhead and sweat trickles down the back of his neck. He glances up to see Aiko approaching along the narrow path, a bundle in her arms wrapped in faded cloth. She kneels at the paddy's edge and unwraps the bundle to reveal 2 rice balls and a flask of barley tea. They share a moment there on the embankment, 2 figures crouched in the mud, heads bowed over a simple meal that tastes of salt and warmth and the promise of a few more hours with us, strength. Aiko asks softly if the fields are sound. Taro tells her of the foxes, the breach, the cold clay pressed into place. She listens without interrupting, her eyes flicking across the paddies as if she too searches for cracks and secrets in the earth. She says nothing of her own work. The children fed, the fire tended, the water fetched from the communal well that lies a good walk away, the firewood gathered in secret under the watchful eyes of the forest's keepers. When the meal is done, she touches his arm before turning back. He watches her walk away, her faded sleeves brushing against the rice stalks, the sun catching in her hair. He thinks of the many years they have bent their backs together, he to the fields, she to the hearth, and of how each harvest binds them tighter to the same unending circle. By late afternoon, the paddies glisten under the weight of the sun. The air hums with cicadas, their song rising and falling like the breath of the land itself. Taro straightens, wiping sweat from his brow, and gazes across the patchwork of fields. He sees other villagers bent just as he is, tiny, stooped shapes in the vast green. They do not speak, but they share this toil as they share the seasons and the taxes, and the long, silent prayers that tomorrow will not bring ruin. When the sun dips low again, painting the paddies in strokes of gold and shadow, Taro gathers his tools and trudges home. His feet leave prints in the soft earth, quickly swallowed by the darkening mud. At the farmhouse, Aiko waits with the children, who chase each other barefoot among the reeds. Their laughter drifts on the dusk air, a fragile music that makes Taro pause, leaning his hoe against the wall as he watches. Inside, the hearth glows with a small, stubborn flame. Tonight, there will be miso soup, thin but warm, ladled carefully to stretch for every hungry mouth. Taro sits cross-legged once more, children clambering around him, Aiko humming softly as she stirs the pot. Outside, the night gathers, the frogs and crickets lifting their voices to the stars. And though tomorrow will demand the same burdens again, for this moment, within these walls, Taro allows himself to believe that this small, flickering peace is enough. Morning arrives with the hush of a gray drizzle, the sort of rain that seeps into every crack and crease, turning the narrow village paths into slick ribbons of mud. Taro wakes to the sound of droplets tapping against the patched roof, each patter a reminder that today will be slower, yet no less demanding. He lies still for a moment, listening to the rain mingle with Aiko's soft breathing and the quiet snuffles of the children pressed close beside them for warmth. When he rises, careful not to disturb the little ones, he feels the stiffness in his joints more keenly than usual. The damp seems to settle in his bones, as if the rain itself has taken root there. He shrugs on his woven jacket, its shoulders worn thin by seasons of sun and storm alike, and steps into the dim light beyond the doorway. Outside, the village hunches under the low sky. Smoke curls lazily from a few chimneys, but most huts keep their hearths low to save precious fuel for colder nights yet to come. Taro moves along the path, sandals sucking at the mud with each step. He carries no umbrella. Such things belong to wealthier folk, merchants in the towns, or the samurai who pass through with lacquered armor and silk banners high above the common muck. He pauses by the paddies, peering at the swollen channels that run along the fields. Too much water can drown the tender shoots, washing away a season's hope in a single careless day. He kneels at the edge, hands plunging into the cold, silt-thick water to clear out leaves and sticks that have floated loose from the trees above. The mud oozes beneath his nails, clinging to his skin like a second earthbound flesh. Further down the path, old Ito is at work again, bent over a basket half-formed beside a lean-to. The old man hums under his breath, a tuneless song carried away by the rain. Beside him, his grandson, not more than 10, sits cross-legged, trying to mimic the weave with clumsy fingers. Taro lifts a hand in greeting. Ito nods without pausing, eyes never leaving the reeds that slip between his gnarled hands. By midday, the drizzle has grown to a steady rain. Taro retreats for a moment beneath a rough shelter built from bamboo poles and scraps of thatch. Here, he squats on his heels, chewing on a strip of dried radish Aiko tucked into his sleeve that morning. The taste is sharp, briny, a thin comfort in the chill. From his perch, he watches the paddies, water shining like quicksilver beneath the sullen sky. It is beautiful in a way, this wide, wet plain that feeds so many yet demands so much in return. A shout rises over the steady hiss of rain. Taro turns to see a figure struggling up the path. Saburo again, though this time he is not alone. Beside him walks a man clad in a travel-stained kimono, broad straw hat pulled low to shield his face from the rain. As they draw near, Taro sees the glint of metal at the stranger's side. A short sword tucked into his sash, its lacquered sheath battered but clean. A samurai's blade, though the man's bearing is humble enough for now. "Taro," Saburo calls, pushing back the brim of his own hat. "This is Shinsuke-sama, a retainer from the manor. He's come with word from the headman." Taro wipes the rain from his brow, stands, and bows low, pressing his muddy hands against his thighs. Shinsuke tips his hat back just enough to show a lean face, rain streaming from his jawline like tears. His eyes, dark and sharp, rest on Taro with the calm weight of someone who is used to being obeyed. "The headman needs hands for the manor road," Shinsuke says without preamble. His voice is mild, but there is iron beneath it. "The last storm washed out the bridge near the river bend. If we do not repair it, the Lord's tax wagons cannot pass. Every able man must bring his tools at dawn tomorrow." Taro bows again, lower this time. "As you wish, Shinsuke-sama." Shinsuke's gaze lingers a moment longer, as if measuring the breadth of Taro's shoulders, the strength left in his arms. Then he nods once, sharp as a blade's edge, and moves on down the path, Saburo trailing behind like a faithful hound. Taro watches them go, the rain spattering against his upturned face. He knows what this means: a day, perhaps 2 or 3, away from his own fields. Weeds will grow unchecked, dikes may weaken, seedlings may bend under too much water or not enough. But refusal is not an option. The road must be whole so the taxes can flow like the rivers that feed the paddies. That night, he returns home soaked through, clothes clinging cold against his skin. Aiko helps him peel away the damp layers, hanging them near the hearth where a meager flame flickers. She listens as he tells her of the bridge, the samurai, the work that must be done. She does not sigh or weep. There is no use in wasting breath on what cannot be changed. Instead, she ladles out their supper, a thin stew stretched with wild greens and a few slivers of salted fish saved from the last market day. The children eat in silence tonight, sensing the heaviness in their father's voice. Kenta, the eldest, leans against Taro's side, small hand resting on his knee, as if to remind him that not all burdens are borne alone. Aiko hums again as she gathers the bowls, her voice low, blending with the steady drum of rain on the thatch overhead. Later, as the children sleep, Taro sits awake by the dying coals. He traces circles in the dirt floor with a fingertip, mind drifting down the winding paths of worry. Tomorrow, His hands will lift stones and shape timbers for a bridge that carries away the fruits of his labor. He wonders if the rain will ease by morning, if his fields will still stand waiting when he returns, or if the water will wash away all he has sown. Yet as sleep pulls at him, he listens to the rain's lullaby on the roof, the soft breaths of his family gathered safe behind him. In this simple shelter of mud and straw, beneath the watchful hush of a cold spring rain, Taro reminds himself, quietly, fiercely, that as long as they wake together when dawn comes, he will endure whatever storms tomorrow brings. Dawn breaks with a reluctant glow behind the rain clouds, the sky a pale shroud of drifting mist. The drizzle has softened to a fine mist that clings to skin and hair, soaking through layers of cloth with quiet persistence. Taro wakes before the first rooster crows, blinking in the grayness as Aiko ties back her hair and presses a folded rice ball into his calloused palm. It is all she can spare from yesterday's pot, rice mixed with wild greens, bound together with a pinch of salt to keep hunger at bay for a few more hours. The children stir as he pulls on his woven jacket, their small faces peeking from under the threadbare blanket. Kenta rubs sleep from his eyes and crawls closer to his father, wrapping thin arms around his leg in silent farewell. Taro rests his hand on the boy's head, rough fingers brushing through tangled hair. No words pass between them, only the warmth of a moment too short. Outside, the village gathers like mist in the half-light. Men stand in small knots, tools slung over shoulders, hoes, mattocks, spades worn smooth by countless seasons of earth and stone. They nod to each other, voices hushed beneath the watchful presence of Shinsuke, the samurai retainer who waits at the head of the muddy road, straw hat low over his sharp eyes. He checks each man as they pass, counting silently, eyes flicking to their feet, their hands, the strength in their backs. He carries no blade today, none visible at least, but the threat of it is there, coiled in the polite bow of his head, the measured calm of his voice. Taro joins the line that snakes down the path toward the river bend. The road is a muddy scar through the paddies, flanked by narrow dikes that strain to hold the swollen water in place. Beside him, Saburo shuffles forward, eyes rimmed red from a sleepless night. They share a glance, equal parts resignation and resolve. There is no sense in speaking. Their breath is better saved for the labor ahead. When they reach the river, the damage reveals itself fully. The old bridge, a simple span of rough-hewn timbers lashed to stone piers, lies in ruin, half of its planks washed downstream during the last storm's rage. The river, fed fat by the spring rains, burbles with a deceptively gentle sound, carrying scraps of straw and broken branches away to the distant sea. Shinsuke steps onto a pile of stones at the bank's edge, his straw sandals sinking slightly in the slick mud. He lifts a hand, and the chatter dies. "Listen well," he says, voice even yet heavy as a falling hammer. "The Lord's wagons must pass within 3 days. Timber must be hauled from the stand to the north, stones set, mud packed, the road firm enough to bear the weight of wheels and beasts alike. You will work until the headman himself walks across this bridge without soiling the hem of his robe. Do you understand?" A ripple of nods passes through the men. None speak. There is nothing to bargain, nothing to question. Shinsuke steps aside, gestures once with an open palm, and the peasants bend to the task like reeds before the wind. Taro finds himself beside Saburo once more, as they trudge toward the tree line, where a cluster of young pines stand ready to surrender their slender trunks. An older man, Genjiro, directs the cutting, his back stooped, but his voice clear as a temple bell. Axes bite into damp wood, the sharp crack of splintering trunks echoing over the river's soft hiss. Each tree that falls is stripped of its branches, rough bark scored away with small knives until the pale heartwood gleams beneath the gray sky. They work in teams of 4, binding the logs with rope woven from hemp and old reeds. Shoulders strain as they drag each trunk down the slippery path to the river's edge. Mud sucks at their feet, cold water seeps into their sandals until their toes are numb. The rain eases now and then, lifting in thin wisps that drift from the steaming backs of working men. By midday, a low fire burns under a makeshift lean-to, just enough to dry hands and warm stiff fingers. They pass around small bundles of rice, half eaten from the morning's supply. Taro sits on an upturned log, watching steam curl from the wet timber they've hauled so far. He eats slowly, mindful of each grain that passes his lips, each mouthful that might keep him standing 1 hour longer. Saburo sits beside him, face hollowed by fatigue, but eyes bright with the stubborn spark that has carried him through lean years and cruel winters alike. They say the headman will come at dusk, Saburo murmurs, voice low enough that only Taro can hear, to see if we are swift enough for his liking. If not, he'll dock the rice due to us for the hours lost. Taro does not answer. There is no answer to such truths, only the silent promise to keep moving, to keep dragging logs through the muck until the road stands whole again. He shifts his gaze to the river, watching its restless flow as though searching for some message hidden in its driftwood and silt. The afternoon passes in a blur of toil. Stones pried from the riverbank with iron pry bars, mud packed into the gaps by hand, bare feet pressing the sticky clay into place. Timbers are laid across the piers, their ends bound together with thick hemp ropes slick with rain. Shinsuke moves among them like a restless shadow, eyes sharp for idleness, blades still sheathed yet no less real for being hidden. By the time dusk folds its soft cloak over the village, the new bridge stands half-formed, a rough skeleton of timber and rope that promises safe passage if the river remains kind. Lanterns flicker along the path now, casting shifting pools of light that dance on the wet stones. The peasants stand back for a moment, backs bent, chests heaving with the day's breathless effort. Shinsuke surveys the work in silence, then nods once, sharp, approving, though no praise passes his lips. "You will return tomorrow," he says. "Finish what you have begun." One by one, the men shoulder their tools and turn for home, feet dragging through the mud, breath ghosting in the chill. Taro walks beside Saburo once more, their silence deeper now, bound by the weight of shared exhaustion. The village huts glow dimly in the distance, small stars scattered across the wet fields. When Taro steps through his doorway, Aiko is waiting with a bowl of thin soup, steam curling around her tired smile. She takes his soaked jacket, rubs warmth back into his numb hands, listens without complaint as he tells her of the logs, the stones, the headman's sharp eyes. The children sleep already, curled like kittens in their corner, untouched for now by the weight that bends their father's shoulders. Taro eats in silence, the taste of broth and bitter greens a balm against the ache in his bones. Outside, the river flows on, the bridge waiting to be born from the labor of calloused hands and weary backs. Tomorrow, the work will go on, as it always does. And though the burden seems unending, here, in the hush of his small hearth, with Aiko's hands brushing his sleeve and the faint warmth of his sleeping children nearby, he dares to hope that, for tonight, it is enough to simply endure. Before the first hints of dawn reach the drifting mist outside, Taro is awake once more, his eyes tracing the thin line where the wall of the hut meets the low roof. He listens to the slow breathing of Aiko beside him, the gentle rustle of the children turning in their sleep. The ache in his shoulders and legs is a dull, familiar drumbeat, one that reminds him he is alive, that the bridge is not yet done, that the day will demand more than the day before. He slips from under the thin blanket, careful not to wake Kenta, who is curled against his side like a small, stubborn warmth through the cold hours of the night. Taro pulls on his jacket, the fabric still damp at the seams, and ties a length of frayed rope around his waist to keep it snug. Aiko stirs, blinking sleep from her eyes. Without a word, she reaches for the small wooden bowl that holds the rice ball she pressed together in the hush of midnight, rice mixed with pickled radish for salt and bite, all she could spare from the dwindling store. Their eyes meet for a heartbeat in the half-light. Aiko's gaze lingers on him, soft but steady, as if she would gather the pieces of his weariness and hide them away where no tax or taskmaster could ever reach. Taro bows his head, the smallest nod of gratitude, before stepping out into the chill gray dawn. Outside, the village is already stirring, figures moving like shadows through drifting mist. Men gather along the muddy path leading to the bridge, their tools slung over shoulders, voices low. No one complains. Such words are wasted breath in a place where the choice is never whether to work, only how long a body can bear it. Saburo is there, stamping his feet to shake off the morning's damp. He greets Taro with a tilt of his chin. Neither man bothers with words. There is nothing new to say that the ache in their bones does not already speak for them. They follow the path down to the river bend, where the unfinished bridge waits in the dawn fog. Shinsuke stands near the riverbank, arms folded within his sleeves, the hem of his robe untouched by the mud that stains every peasant's feet. He does not speak at first. His eyes drift from man to man, counting, measuring, ensuring that no pair of hands is missing. Then, with a curt nod, he gestures for them to begin. Today's work is the setting of the final timbers, each one a burden heavier than its weight suggests. Taro takes up his place with 3 others, Saburo, old Genjiro, and a young man named Haru, whose arms are thin but whose spirit has not yet bowed beneath the years. Together they brace the length of timber on their shoulders, stepping slow and careful along the slick riverbank. The mud pulls at their feet, the cold bites through their sandals, but they keep moving. One foot, then the next, until the beam finds its place in the lattice of the bridge. Ropes must be lashed tight, knots pulled with hands numb from the river's chill. Taro works beside Haru, guiding the young man's fumbling fingers over and under the slick hemp strands. Haru's breath comes in quick bursts, his face pale as he stammers apologies for each slip, each knot too loose. Taro only shakes his head, patient as an older brother, showing again and again how the rope must bind wood to wood so that the flood cannot tear it free. The sun lifts behind the clouds, pale and watery, offering little warmth but enough light to see the labor that remains. Stones are carried one by one to shore up the bridge's base, mud packed around them with blunt sticks and bare hands. Shinsuke's shadow passes over them now and then, a flicker of polished sandals, the soft rustle of cloth too fine for this muddy world. When noon comes, they pause to swallow what small food they carry. Taro sits on a broad stone, hands raw and red. He unwraps his rice ball, breaks it in half, and without a word, presses one piece into Haru's shaking hands. The young man hesitates, eyes wide with surprise, but Taro only nods and turns his gaze back to the river. They eat in silence, steam rising from their breath, drifting away into the gray. As they rest, Taro's eyes wander to the far bank where reeds sway in the gentle current. He remembers when he was Haru's age, shoulders lean, spirit fierce, certain that if he worked hard enough, bent low enough, he might someday earn the headman's favor, spare his children the ache in his own back. Yet here he is, years later, the same river at his feet, the same tax wagons waiting for the road to be whole again. When the break ends, the men rise together, shoulders set, breath braced against the hours ahead. They haul more stone, brace more timbers, push their bodies until arms tremble and legs sink knee-deep in the sucking mud. Once, Saburo slips and nearly tumbles into the cold river, saved only by Taro's quick grip on his sleeve. They exchange a brief laugh, dry and hollow, but real enough to remind them they are still men, not yet ghosts drifting between paddies and road. By dusk, the bridge stands nearly whole, a rough span of pine and stone that bows gently under its own new weight. Shinsuke steps onto it, testing each plank with slow, deliberate steps. The men hold their breath as he walks from one end to the other, his sandals tapping softly on the wet wood. When he reaches the far bank without a pause, he turns, offers a single nod, then slips away down the path without another word. The men stand together for a moment, eyes turned to the bridge that will carry away their rice, their labor, their hope of warmth through the coming winter. There is no cheer, no praise, only a quiet understanding that the Lord's burden has been mended with the marrow of their bones. Taro trudges home in the deepening dusk, feet heavy, head low. At the doorway, Aiko waits, lantern raised high enough to guide him through the gathering dark. She says nothing as she takes his tools, as she brushes flecks of mud from his cheek with the sleeve of her robe. The children wake long enough to see him sink to the floor beside the hearth, where a thin broth steams in a battered pot. Kenta crawls into his lap, small head resting against his chest, as if to stake a claim on the warmth his father's weary body still carries. As the wind rattles the patched walls and the river hums beyond the paddies, Taro closes his eyes. He knows tomorrow he will return to his fields, rice to tend, dikes to mend, weeds to pull before they strangle what little hope remains. But tonight, with the bridge standing behind him and his family gathered close in the flickering lamplight, he lets himself believe, just for this fragile moment, that his hands have held back the river's hunger for one more day. When the first warmth of dawn touches the thatched roof, the mist that clung so stubbornly to the patties the day before begins to drift away, revealing a sky washed clean by days of soft rain. Taro rises with the slow, careful motion of a man who feels every knot in his back, every stubborn ache in his shoulders. Beside him, Aiko stirs, already reaching for the small cloth bundle that holds what is left of the rice. She unwraps it with thin fingers, her touch gentle yet quick, measuring with her eyes how much can be spared for the day's labor and how much must be saved for the children's morning meal. Kenta sleeps on, curled in a tight knot near the hearth, his breath slow and even. Taro lingers a moment longer, watching his son's small chest rise and fall. In Kenta's sleep, there is no sign of the world's hunger, no hint of the burden that bends his father's back each dawn. Taro lets out a breath he did not know he held, then stands, feeling the pull in his thighs where yesterday's lifting and hauling carved its silent price. The bridge is finished now, and the road lies open for the headman's wagons and the samurai's bright horses. The tax will come soon, bundles of rice bound with straw rope, carried on bent backs down that same road he helped mend. But today, at least, the patties call again. The weeds have grown bold in his absence, thin green fingers creeping among the tender shoots. The dikes must be checked, the water's restless edge watched with an eye sharpened by need. Outside, the world is bright with a gentle sun. A breeze moves through the young rice, setting the green blades whispering secrets to one another. Taro steps into the muddy path, his hoe balanced across his shoulder, its wooden handle polished smooth by the press of his palms over years uncounted. The scent of wet earth fills his lungs, rich and pungent, the breath of the fields that hold his family's fragile future. Along the path, other villagers move as he does, silent shapes bent beneath tools and baskets. Saburo waves from his own paddy, already knee-deep in water, sleeves rolled high as he pulls at weeds that dare root where rice should reign. They share a nod, a thin smile that says, "We are still here, the bridge is behind us, the fields are before us." One day at a time. Taro kneels at the paddy's edge, rolling his trousers to his thighs, slipping bare feet into the cool mud. The first step is always a shock, water sliding between toes, mud tugging at ankles, a soft reminder that the soil owns him as much as he tends it. He bends low, fingers darting among the shoots, plucking away the stubborn invaders one by one. Each weed is small but hungry, each root a tiny theft from the yield he owes to the headman, to the samurai, to the distant lord who has never walked this path yet claims its every grain. Aiko's voice drifts from the house now and then, faint across the paddies. She calls to the children, coaxes them to gather kindling from the thin stand of bamboo near the village edge. Kenta's laughter rises above his younger sister's shrill protest when he teases her with a bundle of twigs. Taro closes his eyes at the sound, letting it wash over him like sunlight breaking through rain. He does not turn to watch. There is no time for lingering. The weeds demand his patience. The water demands his vigilance. By mid-morning, the sun has grown warm enough to bead sweat along his brow. He pauses to wipe it away with the back of his arm, smearing mud across his cheek in the process. Further down the row, he sees Genjiro, old and slow, yet still stubbornly standing knee-deep in his own patch of green. Each stoop and pull costs Genjiro more than it once did. But he works on, lips moving in some silent prayer to the rice spirits that watch over these fragile stalks. A soft splash breaks Taro's thoughts. He turns to see Haru, the young man from the bridge work, standing awkwardly at the paddy's edge. In his hands, he clutches a bundle of reeds tied with rough twine, fresh thatch for Taro's leaking roof, a quiet gift pressed together from scraps. Haru bows low, so low his nose nearly touches his knees. "Taro-san," Haru says, voice shy but steady. "My mother sent this. She says you saved me from the river's bite when I slipped on the logs. She says we owe you a roof that does not drip on your children's heads." Taro blinks at the bundle, words gathering slowly behind his teeth. He remembers Haru's hands trembling over the bridge ropes, remembers steadying them, showing him how to bind tight knots even as the river gnawed at their feet. He does not feel like a savior, only another back bent to another task. Yet he bows in return, deeper than he must, accepting the gift not as debt repaid, but as one more thread binding neighbor to neighbor. "Tell your mother I thank her," Taro says, voice rough from the morning silence. Tell her my family sleeps warmer for her kindness. Haru bows again, cheeks pink with relief, then turns and picks his way back along the narrow dike. Taro watches him go. The young man sandals, leaving small prints that will fill with water before the sun reaches its peak. Afternoon settles softly over the paddies, the breeze carrying the warm scent of growing things. Taro works until the shadows begin to lean long across the flooded fields. The weeds yield at last to his patience. The water runs clear through the narrow channels he patches with careful hands. He stands for a moment, rolling his shoulders, feeling the pull of tired muscles ease beneath the waning sun. When he returns to the hut, he carries the bundle of reeds under one arm. Aiko greets him with a tired smile, Kenta peeking from behind her skirts, eyes bright with curiosity at the promise of a roof that might no longer weep during the night's rain. Together, they sit on the threshold as dusk spills across the village, Aiko mending a frayed sleeve, Taro smoothing the reeds between his palms, Kenta chattering about frogs caught among the paddies. And as night folds its velvet cloak over their small corner of the world, Taro leans back against the wall of his hut, breath slow and steady, the day's labor pressed deep into his bones. The bridge behind him, the fields before him, the laughter of his child wrapped close around him, these are the threads that hold him upright as the first stars prick the sky. For tonight, he thinks, these small moments are enough to keep the darkness at the door. The hush of dawn finds Taro awake before the first bird dares break the darkness with its cautious song. He sits cross-legged near the hearth, eyes tracing the faint glow of embers that whisper warmth into the small room. Aiko sleeps nearby, her head turned toward him, hair loose across her shoulder like a spill of midnight silk. Beyond her, the children dream, curled together on the straw mat, their thin breaths threading through the stillness like tiny prayers. In the corner, the bundle of fresh reeds waits, a promise yet to be woven into the roof above their heads. Taro's eyes drift to it now and then, his mind already measuring how best to bind each stalk, which patch leaks worst when the rain comes heavy and the night grows long. But the roof must wait. Today belongs to the paddies once more, and to the faint hope that the season's promise will hold firm. He stands slowly, mindful of the quiet. His feet find his sandals in the half-light, their thongs rough against the skin rubbed raw by days spent knee-deep in mud. Aiko stirs as he lifts his hoe from its resting place near the door. She does not speak, only reaches for his sleeve, her fingers brushing the coarse cloth, a touch that says all that must be said. Be safe, work well, come home. Outside, the world stirs with a low hum of waking life. Thin wisps of mist cling to the paddies, their glassy surface mirroring a sky painted in gentle strokes of pale blue and soft gray. Here and there, dark shapes move, neighbors bent low over their plots, backs already glistening with the morning's labor. Taro nods to each as he passes, his own shoulders straightening with a quiet resolve that feels like borrowed courage from the rising sun. At the far edge of his field, he pauses to study the water, watching how it curls around the young shoots, how it gathers in shallow pools near the dikes. A small breach waits near the corner, a slip of mud that threatens to let precious water drain away if left unattended. He kneels there, pressing his palms deep into the wet clay, packing it firm, feeling the earth give beneath his touch yet yield to his will. Each handful is a promise to his family, that no drop will be wasted, that each stalk will stand tall come harvest. By mid-morning, the sun has begun to climb, warm enough to draw sweat along his brow, down his neck, to dampen the cloth that clings to his back. He pauses now and then, leaning on the hoe, letting his eyes drift across the paddies where dragonflies hover like tiny guardians above the water's skin. He sees Genjiro a few plots away, pausing to stretch his stiff back, the old man's movements careful yet steady. Beyond him, Saburo's voice rises in soft song, a work tune half sung to himself, half sung to the weeds he wages war upon. Taro returns to his labor. Each weed he pulls slips free with a soft sigh, a single small victory in a world that offers few. He works in silence, the only sounds the murmur of water, the soft rustle of rice leaves brushing against one another, the far-off clatter of a wooden bucket dropped at the well where the village women gather to draw the day's water. When the sun is high, Aiko appears along the narrow dike path, a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth balanced in her hands. She walks carefully, skirts lifted above the muck, her hair pinned back from her face. Taro watches her approach, a warmth unfurling in his chest that has nothing to do with the sun's heat. She kneels beside him, opens the bundle to reveal 2 rice balls, pressed firm and sprinkled with flakes of dried fish. A rare blessing, saved from the last visit of the traveling fish seller, who comes only when the roads are passable and the bridge stands strong. Taro takes the food with a bow of his head, careful not to let his muddy hands brush the clean cloth. They eat together on the narrow dike, knees almost touching, eyes lifted now and then to the gentle dance of the dragonflies. Aiko tells him that Kenta chased a frog clear into the neighbor's plot that morning, earning a scolding from old Ito, but also a small laugh that eased the old man's scowl. She speaks of the new patch of reeds he left by the door, asks when he will have the time to weave it into the roof, to mend the leaks before the next rain comes. Taro smiles at that, promises that when the fields are sound, the roof will follow. When the meal is done, Aiko lingers, her hands brushing away stray grains of rice from his sleeve. She says nothing more, only rests her palm against his cheek for a fleeting breath before standing and making her way back along the dike, her figure small yet steady against the wide expanse of green. The afternoon stretches on, slow and heavy with heat. Taro moves carefully now, mindful of the ache that creeps into his arms, the tight pull in his shoulders that reminds him the bridge's labor still lingers in his bones. He hums under his breath, a tune he does not remember learning, perhaps taught by the wind that sighs through the rice, or the soft calls of the frogs that keep watch at the paddy's edge. Near sundown, he stands once more at the breach he mended that morning, pressing the clay with his foot, testing its hold. Satisfied, he gathers his tools, rinses his hands in the shallow canal, the mud swirling away to join the river that runs ever onward to places he will never see. When he reaches the hut, dusk has begun to settle its gentle hush over the village. The children greet him with bright eyes and questions tumbling over each other. Did he see the frog? Did he hear the kite that wheeled overhead at midday? Did he know that Mother promises a story tonight before the coals burn low? Aiko waits by the door, her sleeves rolled as she stirs the small pot over the hearth. The bundle of reeds lies nearby, ready for tomorrow's mending when time and weather allow. Taro sits cross-legged near the children, Kenta clambering into his lap, chattering about the frog in the well and the neighbors scolding. Taro listens with a soft smile, his weary hands steady against the small, warm weight of his son. Outside, the stars prick the sky one by one, their pale light mirrored in the dark glass of the paddies. Inside, the thin soup bubbles gently, carrying the faint scent of wild greens and the last of the dried fish. And though tomorrow will wake him again before the dawn, with weeds to pull and dikes to mend and a roof still waiting for his hands, tonight, within these patched walls and gentle shadows, Taro lets his eyes drift shut, the quiet hum of his family's voices weaving a lullaby deeper than any river's song. The hush of the night gives way to a soft chorus of waking birds, their calls drifting like silver threads through the thin walls of Taro's hut. He opens his eyes to the fragile light of dawn, pressing through the gaps in the thatch above. Aiko is already awake beside the hearth, coaxing a small flame to life with careful breaths and slivers of dry bamboo. The children stir near her feet, small bodies curled together beneath the same thin blanket that has warded off countless cold nights. Taro sits up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his spine protest at first, then yield beneath the slow roll of his shoulders. The bundle of reeds leans against the far wall, exactly where Haru left it days before. Today, he tells himself, he will mend the roof. If the sky holds, if the paddies stay true, if his hands find enough strength left after the fields have taken their share. Aiko glances up as he rises, her eyes soft but sharp enough to catch the hitch in his breath. She presses a small bowl into his hands. Thin rice porridge, steam curling above it like a promise that warmth still lives here, however small. Kenta, already awake now, clambers to his father's side and peers into the bowl as though hoping some stray bit of sweetness might hide among the plain grains. Taro shares the first spoonful with his son, watching the boy's grin flash wide and quick before he darts back to his sister, waving his arms like a small lord commanding an imaginary army of frogs and sparrows. Taro eats the rest slowly, savoring each mouthful for the strength it must carry him through the long hours ahead. When he steps outside, the sky is a pale canvas streaked with gold, the air fresh and sharp as a blade's edge. The patties lie before him, the dark mirrors that catch the early light and scatter it back in trembling ripples. He shoulders his hoe and walks the narrow path, sandals squelching in the soft mud, the faint chill of morning clinging to his ankles. At the far edge of his plot, the dikes hold strong where he patched them, though here and there the water sits too high along the edge. He kneels, pressing his palms into the wet clay, pushing it firm. His fingers sink deep, the cold biting beneath his nails. For a moment he closes his eyes and listens, to the frogs croaking in the shallows, to the distant murmur of neighbors greeting the day with voices low and careful. Somewhere down the rows, Saburo's laugh rises and falls, the only bright thing cutting through the slow rhythm of labor. Hours drift past in this quiet dance, stoop, pull, press, stand. The weeds are cunning, their roots clutching at the rich earth, stealing what the rice needs to grow strong enough to stand against the autumn storms. Taro works steadily, mindful not to wrench the young shoots as he clears away each stray blade of grass. Sweat beads on his brow, drips from his chin into the waiting mud, a small offering back to the soil that claims every part of him. When the sun lifts high enough to burn away the last tatters of mist, he rests for a moment at the edge of the field. His eyes follow the narrow road that curves away toward the manor on the low rise beyond the paddies. Even from here, he can see the faint line where the new bridge crosses the restless river. He wonders who crosses it now. Tax collectors counting sacks of rice, merchants with their wagons creaking under salt and dried fish, perhaps a samurai on a quiet horse, gaze cold as winter's bite. That bridge, built from the sweat of men like him, stands as both promise and warning. The Lord's reach stretches far, and the harvest will find its way to his granaries, no matter how deep the hunger in the villages below. A movement pulls Taro's thoughts back to the fields. Haru again, young and bright-eyed despite the dark circles beneath his lids. He bows as he approaches, carrying a coil of new rope slung over one shoulder. Taro-san, Haru calls, voice carrying over the hush of rustling rice. Genjiro says the well's rope is frayed. He fears it might snap before the month ends. He asks, if you have a moment this evening, could you help bind it new? My knots still slip. Taro pushes himself upright, brushing mud from his palms. He nods once, not with any sense of obligation, but with the quiet understanding that threads like these, shared tasks, offered hands, are what hold the village together when the storms come and the taxman stands waiting. Tell Genjiro I'll come when the sun falls, he says. Haru bows again, nearly dropping the coil in his eagerness to show respect. Taro smiles faintly as he watches the young man hurry off down the narrow path, feet splashing in shallow puddles left from the days of rain. The afternoon drifts by in the same steady measure. The sun overhead, the breeze warm now, and carrying the dry smell of nearby hearths where women boil what scraps they've gathered for the noon meal. Taro pauses only when his belly reminds him how thin the morning's porridge was. He sits at the edge of the paddy, feet dangling in the clear water, eyes turned toward the far tree line where the bamboo stand whispers in the wind. His mind drifts, as it always does, to the future he does not dare speak aloud, of Kenta grown strong enough to help him here, of Aiko resting without worry for wood or grain, of a roof so tightly woven the rain must seek some other poor soul to haunt. He knows better than to name these dreams, yet they root themselves deep as the weeds he pulls each dawn. When the sun leans low and the shadows stretch long across the muddy rows, Taro gathers his tools and heads home, but not to rest. The bundle of reeds waits by the door. He nods to Aiko as he lifts it, stepping lightly to the side of the hut where the worst leaks have turned the wall dark with old rain. He works there, threading stalk to stalk, pressing the fresh thatch tight against the frame with careful, practiced fingers. Inside, Aiko's voice drifts out in gentle song, something soft and old that her mother once sang, a tune that clings to the children as they drowse beside the hearth. The smell of broth slips through the door too, thin yet comforting, steeped with wild greens and the last shreds of dried root. When the roof patching is done, Taro turns at last toward the well, where Genjiro waits in the hush of dusk. Together, old hands and young hands tie the rope firm and true. They speak little, yet their silence is a bond stronger than any knot. And when the final coil is tested and the bucket dips smooth into the dark, cool water, Taro stands a while longer by the well's edge, listening to the quiet song of frogs hidden among the reeds. In that hush, with dusk folding itself gently around the village, he breathes out a slow promise to the night that tomorrow he will rise again, shoulders strong enough for one more day beneath the open sky. The night drifts over the village like a soft, worn blanket, carrying the hush of distant frogs and the whisper of a breeze slipping between the patched walls of Taro's hut. Inside, the hearth has burned low, a single coal pulsing like a watchful eye in the dark. Aiko lies curled near the children, one hand resting on Kenta's back, as if to hold him in some gentle dream where hunger and storms have no place. Taro sits near the door, his back pressed to the rough wood, eyes half closed, yet not fully surrendered to sleep. He listens to the small sounds, a bamboo shutter tapping in the night wind, the faint creak of the roof adjusting to the night's breath, the slow, steady murmur of Aiko's breathing. His hands rest on his knees, palms rough and nicked, the skin along his fingers cracked where the water and clay have claimed it season after season. He rubs his thumb along a ridge of old scar tissue, a memory of the first tool he ever held, too big for his boy's hands, but pressed there by his father's wordless trust. Outside, the stars scatter themselves thinly across the dark, their pale flicker mirrored in the paddies that lie still and watchful beneath them. The night air tastes of damp earth and old smoke. Taro lets his eyes drift shut, only to open them again when a soft footfall brushes the dirt outside. A polite cough breaks the hush. He rises, careful not to stir the children, and steps into the cool darkness. Haru stands near the well, the coil of new rope they bound together now tied neatly in place. In his hands, the young man holds a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Taro-san," Haru says, voice low but eager, as if afraid to wake the world around them. "My mother, she sent this. A few sweet potatoes from our garden. Not much, but she says it is thanks for your hands." Haru thrusts the bundle forward, almost too quickly. Taro sees how the boy's fingers tremble, how his eyes dart to the shadows as if he fears being seen giving away what might well feed his own family. He knows the cost hidden inside that cloth. Sweet potatoes coaxed from thin soil at the edge of the bamboo stand, where roots fight stone for space. He takes the bundle with both hands, bowing deep enough that Haru flinches as if to protest the gesture. "Tell your mother her kindness feeds more than our bellies," Taro says, voice steady. "It feeds our hope." Haru bows in return, awkward but earnest, and slips back down the narrow path toward his own small patch of light in the dark. Taro watches him go until the rustle of reeds swallows his steps. Then he crouches by the well, unwrapping the bundle to glimpse the pale skin of the sweet potatoes within. Small, knotted, precious. He cradles them in his palms a moment longer before wrapping them tight again and slipping back inside the hut. Aiko stirs when he sets the bundle near the hearth. She lifts her head, hair tumbling loose across her cheek. Her eyes find his in the dim glow of the dying coal. There is no need to explain. She sees the shape of the gift, understands what it cost, what it means. She nods once, sleep pulling at her again, trust heavy in her gaze. Taro lowers himself to the floor, stretches his tired legs beside the warm huddle of the children. Kenta shifts in his sleep, pressing closer, his small hand resting on his father's wrist as if to tether him to this quiet shore between night and dawn. And so he drifts, the soft chorus of the frogs weaving through the thin walls, the hush of Aiko's breathing beside the hearth, the new rope at the well, the patched roof holding back the stars. These small things, these fragile offerings passed from hand to hand, from neighbor to neighbor. These are the mortar that holds the village upright when storms batter the rice and taxes strip the granaries bare. When the first gray threads of dawn find their way through the cracks in the wall, Taro wakes to the slow warmth of Kenta's breath against his arm. He rises without sound, careful not to break the thin web of sleep that still wraps his family in its gentle hold. He unwraps the bundle near the hearth, selects one of the small sweet potatoes, and sets it carefully in the embers, rolling it until the skin begins to darken, and the faintest curl of sweet smoke lifts toward the roof. Aiko wakes to the smell and sits beside him, her shoulder brushing his as they watch the small potato roast in the coals. They share it without words, each bite soft and warm, carrying with it the taste of another family's garden, another family's faith that tomorrow might hold enough for them all. When the children wake, they find their parents side by the hearth, faces turned to the small flame that fights the morning chill. Outside, the village is stirring, soft voices drifting through the mist, the steady slap of sandals on the muddy path. Somewhere beyond the paddies, a crow caws once, a sharp note that marks the first task waiting, the first burden to be lifted. Taro rises, brushing the ashes from his palms, lifting his hoe once more. The sweet taste lingers on his tongue, warm against the damp air that waits beyond the door. He steps into the dawn, the path unfolding before him through the glistening paddies where dragonflies hover like tiny guardians of tomorrow's fragile promise. And with each careful step, he carries the gift of last night's kindness like a hidden ember against the cold that waits beyond the fields. The dawn broke pale and hesitant over the scattered hamlets nestled between rice paddies and wooded ridges. In the 10th part of this quiet telling, let us drift into the unspoken burdens that tied the peasant's life to the very soil beneath his feet, a soil that promised both life and sorrow, sustenance and servitude. On the outskirts of a modest village named Himorogi, a man named Genjiro rose with the day's first breath of wind. His hair was bound back in a simple knot, his clothes patched so often that no single cloth could claim to be original. His wife Asa was already awake, stooping by the hearth to coax warmth from embers grown shy in the night's damp chill. Their children, 3 slight shapes curled together beneath a single rough blanket, murmured in their dreams of warmer days and fuller bowls. Genjiro stepped outside and felt the dew slip through his sandals. The fields waited, just beyond the low fence of bamboo and brush. They were fields leased from a distant lord whose name Genjiro would never dare speak aloud. To work them was to survive, but also to owe rice for tax, labor for service, and fear for any whisper of defiance. Each spring, he and his neighbors gathered to repair the levees and clear the irrigation ditches, their sweat ensuring that the precious water from the mountains found its way in steady veins through their paddies. If the water faltered, the rice would fail. If the rice failed, so too would they. That year, rumors drifted like stray ash from the mountains, bandits stirring in hidden passes, taxes soon to rise, the local magistrate soldiers sighted on nearby roads. All these shadows weighed upon Genjiro as he shouldered his hoe and stepped into the paddies. His breath misted before him, mixing with the faint steam that rose where the early sun warmed the shallow pools. Behind him, Asa tended the garden patch beside their dwelling, hoping to coax a few radishes and herbs from the stubborn earth. As Genjiro worked, the rhythm of the hoe striking the wet earth echoed the beat of his heart, steady, resigned, yet always a little fearful of interruption. For it was not merely the soil he turned, but a debt that would never settle. Taxes were demanded in rice, yet seed must be saved to sow again, and children must eat to grow strong enough to help in the fields. Every grain he laid aside for the Lord was a grain he took from his own bowl. And if the harvest proved poor, if rains came too late or pests came too soon, then hunger crept into the house like a polite but insistent guest who would not leave. Sometimes, Genjiro dreamed of another life, a life where a man might own his plot of land outright, where his sweat bought security rather than suspicion. But such dreams were dangerous. In the village, elders spoke quietly of what befell those who questioned their lot too openly. A man named Saburo had once dared to protest the unfair share demanded by the local steward. No one knew where he had gone, but his wife still sat by her door each dusk, staring down the path as if hoping he might return, whole and unharmed, though all knew he would not. When midday came, Genjiro paused to eat. Asa brought him a small parcel of barley rice and pickled greens, wrapped in cloth. She sat with him at the edge of the paddy, the hush of the water and the drone of insects their only company. They spoke little. Words were precious, best saved for when they might ease a child's fears or lighten a long night by the fire. Yet as she passed him the food, her eyes met his, and in that brief glance lay all the sorrow and stubbornness that held their family together. The children joined them for a while, skipping along the raised banks between paddies. Their feet splashed in the shallow channels, and for a few moments, laughter mingled with the croak of frogs and the wind sighing through the rice stalks. Genjiro watched them, torn between pride and a dull ache that they too would grow into this same cycle. His eldest, a boy named Taichi, already asked questions. Why they must bow so low when the steward's men passed, why they must give so much and keep so little. Genjiro had no answers fit for a child's ears. He could only tell Taichi to work hard, to be respectful, to keep his head low. That was the only shield he could offer. As the sun dipped lower, Genjiro returned to work. His hoe rose and fell, the mud sucking at his feet. Shadows lengthened across the paddies, but still he labored on. A peasant's day did not end with the sun. There was wood to gather for the hearth, straw to twist into sandals and mats, tools to mend by the flicker of a lantern's flame. In the dark, after the children slept, Genjiro and Asa would sit together in silence, broken only by the soft rasp of their hands, busy with small tasks. Patching clothing, binding rope, readying for another dawn exactly like this one. Yet even in this quiet, the burdens pressed close. In the next village over, rumors told of new taxes, a forced labor draft for the castle town's fortifications, extra levies for a war that none of these farmers would ever see. And so Genjiro wondered how many grains could be spared, how many hours stolen from the fields could be survived without a family going hungry. When he finally lay down, every bone in his body ached as if it knew the shape of the furrows he had carved. Outside, the wind carried the scent of distant forests. Somewhere, a night bird called. Genjiro listened, drifting into a shallow sleep where he dreamed not of escape, nor of rebellion, but of a single simple wish. That tomorrow the rains would come as they ought. That the steward's men would pass by his house without pausing. That his children might laugh again in the fields when the sun returned. Small hopes, fragile as the rice seedlings trembling in the paddies. Yet in them lay all the strength the peasants of Himorogi could ever claim as their own. In the hush that followed the day's toil, the village of Himorogi lay wrapped in a thin veil of mist that rose from the paddies like drifting ghosts. In the small house where Genjiro's family slept, the night was not wholly quiet. Crickets sang in the eaves, and the old timbers of the dwelling creaked as if murmuring secrets to the dark. Within, Asa stirred. She rose carefully from the mat so as not to wake the children, who lay curled beside Genjiro, their soft breaths proof that for a few hours at least they were free from hunger and worry. Asa stepped outside, her bare feet whispering against the packed earth. She paused at the threshold, letting the cool night air wash over her. The sky above was a shroud of stars, pale and many, yet offering no answers. She carried a small bundle of dried herbs in her sleeve. A charm, really, passed from her mother, meant to keep illness at bay. Illness was a quiet terror in a village such as theirs. A single cough that lingered too long could mean a season undone, a family's ruin hastened by fever or wasting sickness. She knelt by the little garden that clung to life beside the house. The radishes and herbs bent under beads of dew that glimmered like tiny lanterns. She touched each plant gently, murmuring a small prayer. Not to any grand god in the temples of the capital. Those gods were for lords and monks who slept under tiled roofs. Asa's prayers were to the small spirits of field and water, to her ancestors who she hoped might see her and remember. In these hushed moments, she found a kind of strength that the daylight did not grant. When she returned inside, she found Genjiro awake, eyes glinting in the glow of a single oil lamp. He did not ask where she had gone. He knew. She knelt beside him, and for a time, they simply sat together, two figures hunched over the faint warmth of the flame. There was comfort in the silence between them. Words were precious, yes, but some truths needed no sound to be understood. Genjiro finally spoke of what had weighed upon him for days. He had heard, he said, from a peddler passing through that the local daimyo planned to send new collectors. Strangers with new demands, new ledgers inked with figures too cruel to meet. The peddler had whispered that some villages had fled deeper into the forests to escape these demands, vanishing like smoke among the pines and mountain trails. Yet such thoughts were dangerous. Running brought its own miseries. Hunger, exposure, the wrath of samurai who would hunt down peasants like stray dogs. Asa listened, her hands folded in her lap. She asked him if they could hide any of the harvest, but they both knew the stewards were thorough. Each year, the rice was measured, weighed, counted grain by grain. To hide a portion meant risking a beating, or worse. To defy the ledger was to mark one's name for punishment. Yet the thought hung there between them, fragile but tempting. A secret sack of rice buried beneath the floorboards, perhaps, or hidden among reeds near the river's bend. Their whispered fears were broken by the sudden rustle of their eldest son, Taichi, who had woken and now peered at them with wide eyes. Genjiro motioned him closer. The boy crawled to his father's side, resting his head on Genjiro's knee. He asked if the harvest would be enough this year. Genjiro ruffled his hair and spoke soft lies. Yes, enough for rice cakes at the festival, enough to trade for cloth to mend his robe, enough to fill their bowls so no belly would rumble through the winter. Asa closed her eyes, letting the lie settle like a blanket over her heart. In the morning, the village came alive in the blue haze of dawn. A horn sounded from the main path, a low note that turned every head. The steward's men had come earlier than expected, mounted on stout horses, their armor dull with dust, but their swords bright. Children peered from behind shutters. Women gathered their infants to their breasts. Genjiro stepped outside with Taichi at his heel. All around them, neighbors did the same, forming a ragged line along the muddy path. The steward's man, tall and thin-faced beneath his conical hat, called out names from a scroll. One by one, peasants stepped forward to bow, offering records of their paddy's yield, pledging what portion would go to the lord's storehouses. Beside each name, the steward's assistant made a careful mark, a stroke of ink that weighed heavier than any hammer. Genjiro's turn came. He stepped forward, heart pounding not from defiance, but from the helpless hope that perhaps, by some miracle, the weight demanded might be less this time. The steward's man did not look at him. He read the figures flatly and moved on. Behind him, the soldiers shifted, their hands never far from sword hilts. There was no question, no protest, only the cold arithmetic of obligation. When Genjiro stepped back, he saw Taichi watching him, eyes wide, with the knowledge that their small hope of hiding anything had already withered under the steward's gaze. By midday, the men were gone, leaving behind only new demands etched into every household's future. Genjiro sat on the edge of the paddy, staring at the water that reflected the sky so perfectly it seemed to mock him. Asa brought him barley tea, though neither spoke. The children played nearby, but more quietly than before, sensing the heavy mood that clung to the adults. As the sun dipped once more and the evening breeze stirred the paddies to a soft rustle, Genjiro wondered how many more seasons could be endured like this. How long before the soil beneath his feet, which gave so grudgingly, would take from him all he had left to give. Yet beside him, Asa sat still and steady, her presence a quiet promise that somehow they would rise again tomorrow, just as they always had, bound to the land, to each other, to a hope as thin and stubborn as the mist that rose each night from the fields of Himorogi. The days slipped by in a hush of wind and water, each dawn a mirror of the last, each dusk a gentle reminder of burdens yet to come. In Himorogi, life wove itself in small, repeating threads. Fields flooded and drained, rice planted and tended, debts weighed and paid. Yet beneath the patient surface, a quiet unrest stirred like silt in a river's bend, unseen but impossible to forget. It was early autumn now, when the paddies began to shift from vivid green to a softer gold. The air grew cooler, carrying the first hints of distant mountain frost. Genjiro and Asa worked side by side, bent low among the stalks that whispered of harvest soon to come. With them was Taichi, taller now, his hands calloused like his father's, though his eyes still burned with the fierce spark of unspoken questions. That day, the village gathered for a meeting in the clearing beside the small shrine to Inari, where fox statues watched over offerings of rice and sake. The elders called it a gathering of council, a place to speak freely, though all knew that freedom only stretched as far as the shadows of the trees. Rumors had come again on the wind, carried by travelers who bartered salt and news. Far to the east, another village had refused its share of rice. The steward's men had come with torches and swords, burning fields to ash as a lesson to all who might think of keeping too much for themselves. Genjiro stood among his neighbors, arms crossed, eyes downcast as the elders spoke. Old Ryo, whose back was so bent he seemed always to bow, urged caution. Better to suffer a little than lose all. But a younger man named Hachiro, broad-shouldered and blunt-spoken, muttered that starvation was a kind of death too. Hachiro spoke of hiding rice, of gathering in secret, of sending a portion north to traders who might buy it for coin instead of taxes. A dangerous thought, a tempting one. Asa, standing behind Genjiro, listened without showing fear. Her mind turned not to rebellion, but to her children. Taichi, who watched the meeting with eyes too bright, and the younger two who still played at catching frogs by the irrigation ditches. She wondered if they could bear another lean winter, if they could barter herbs or cloth for millet when the rice was gone. Each question folded inside her like a note she could not burn. When the meeting broke, the villagers drifted away in pairs and trios, voices low. No decisions were made, only warnings spoken and fears shared. Genjiro walked back through the fields with Hachiro at his side. The younger man's voice carried the sharp edge of anger. He spoke of how the samurai grew fat in their manners, how they dined on fish and sake, while children in Himorogi sucked on rice gruel too thin to fill their bellies. Genjiro said little. He had heard such talk before, and he knew where it led. Yet as Hachiro's words rolled over him like distant thunder, he felt something stir, a question he dared not name. How long could they bend without breaking? At home, Asa knelt by the hearth, stirring a pot of millet and wild greens. The children sat close, waiting for the thin broth that would warm their bellies, if not fill them. Taichi asked what the elders had said, and Genjiro told him only that the harvest must be good and that they must work hard to bring it in before the rains came. He did not speak of hidden rice or burned villages. Such fears had no place in a child's dreams. That night, after the children lay sleeping, Asa and Genjiro sat together by the hearth. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced on the cracked walls. Asa mended a tear in Taichi's robe, her needle slipping through the worn cloth like a whisper. Genjiro watched the flame, seeing in it the steward's torch, the smoke of fields turned to cinders. He asked Asa if she feared what might come. She paused, the needle resting between her fingers, and said that fear was always there, like the wind in the eaves. But fear did not plant rice, nor mend robes, nor hush a crying child. They would do what they must, as they always had. Outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The night settled around them like an old cloak, patched and thin but warm enough to hold off the cold for now. Asa finished her stitching and set the robe aside. She reached for Genjiro's hand, calloused, scarred, strong in its quiet way. He looked at her and found no answers there, only the same stubborn hope that had carried them through each season of hunger and harvest alike. In the days that followed, the villagers bent to the harvest with a new urgency. The sky hinted at early rains, and the wind carried a chill that urged them to hurry. Genjiro worked with Taichi at his side, father and son wading through the paddies as stalks fell beneath their sickles. Each bundle of rice was laid out to dry on racks of bamboo, a promise of life for the winter, a portion for the Lord, a portion for their own thin bowls. At night, the village fires flickered like a constellation across the paddies. Families sat close, their voices low, their laughter soft but stubborn. In Himorogi, life was not marked by rebellion or revolt, but by the small defiance of waking each day, of planting seed where seed might grow, of feeding a child even when the world said there was not enough to give. And so the people of Himorogi worked on, backs bent, hands raw, eyes lifted sometimes to the sky, searching for rain or mercy, whichever might come first. And beneath the quiet hum of crickets and the hush of wind through drying rice, a single thought took root in Genjiro's heart, that even the meekest field can hide a stone beneath its soil, waiting for the blade that cuts too deep. The harvest days passed in a quiet rush, as if the fields themselves knew how fragile the window was between ripeness and ruin. Genjiro rose before the sun and walked barefoot through the mist that clung low over the paddies. Each step into the damp furrows reminded him how closely his life was bound to these narrow strips of earth, this soil that fed them and chained them in equal measure. Taichi followed his father each morning now, a small sickle tied at his waist, though his arms tired quickly, and his fingers blistered beneath the coarse rope binding the sheaves. Jinjiro watched him with pride and a silent fear that curled around his thoughts like smoke. Pride for the boy's strong spirit. Fear that the world would grind that spirit down as surely as the millstones ground rice into flour. While the men cut stalks and bound them tight, the women gathered what lay at the edges. Fallen grains, stray bundles missed in the rush. Asa's hands were quick and careful. She worked with her neighbors in the hush of dawn, their sleeves damp with dew, their laughter hushed but warm. In these moments, they found brief refuge in each other's presence. A shared burden felt lighter, if only by a grain's weight. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the low ridge and painted the sky in strokes of ashen gold, Jinjiro paused to watch the drying racks stand like thin skeletons against the horizon. He felt the ache in his shoulders as an old friend now, persistent but familiar, a reminder of work well done. Yet as he looked across the paddies, he saw Hachiro walking toward him, his broad form outlined by the last light. Hachiro carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. When he drew close, he spoke without greeting, his voice low. He had set aside a portion of the harvest, hidden among the reeds near the river bend. Rice meant not for the steward, but for the families who would otherwise have to boil their gruel too thin, stretch it with millet and wild greens until it barely deserved the name. He asked Genjiro if he would do the same. Genjiro's breath caught in his throat. The thought of hidden rice was not new, but spoken aloud, it was like standing on the edge of a cliff. To keep rice was theft. To be caught was ruin. Yet as Hachiro's words hung between them, Genjiro thought of Taichi's thin shoulders, the softness of his youngest child's ribs beneath Asa's careful hands. He thought of Asa's quiet sighs when she scraped the pot clean at dusk. He asked Hachiro if the others knew. Hachiro nodded. Some did, some would. It was not rebellion, he said, only survival. One small act of defiance against a hunger that asked no permission. They stood there a while longer, shadows deepening around them until only the faint rustle of drying rice filled the silence. Then, Genjiro gave a small nod, and Hachiro's hand fell on his shoulder, heavy and grateful. That night, Genjiro and Asa sat beside the hearth long after the children had drifted to sleep. He told her what Hachiro had asked, his voice barely above the hiss of the dying fire. Asa listened with her head bowed, the firelight catching in the strands of hair that had slipped from her knot. She did not speak for a long while. When she did, it was only to say that sometimes the smallest wrong was the only way to keep what was right. They chose a corner of the paddy farthest from the footpath, a place where the reeds grew thick and the earth gave way to marsh. There, by moonlight, Genjiro set aside a portion, just a little, bundles wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath layers of straw. Each bundle felt heavy with hope and dread in equal measure. If found, there would be questions, punishments, perhaps the loss of all they had left. But if left undiscovered, it might mean enough rice to see them through the late snows when the storeroom's walls stood bare. In the days that followed, Genjiro worked with a strange tension in his bones, a sharp edge beneath the steady rhythm of his sickle. Each footstep near the hidden place made his breath catch. Each creak of the steward's men passing through the village tightened his chest. Yet he also found a sliver of quiet courage there, too, like a stone hidden beneath soft earth. When the harvest was done and the last sheaves bound, the steward's men came to weigh and count. They moved through Himorogi like shadows with sharp eyes, watching each bundle lifted, each stalk examined for hidden grain. Genjiro stood with his neighbors in the courtyard before the storehouse, his hands clenched behind his back. Hachiro stood nearby, eyes forward, calm as a pond in winter. No words passed between them, but when the steward's men moved on, taking their share with harsh nods and curt marks on their scrolls, a breath seemed to pass through the villagers, a soft, collective sigh that perhaps they had not been found out. Not yet. That night, the fires burned brighter than usual in Himorogi. There was no festival, no reason to celebrate, yet laughter rose anyway, thin but stubborn, drifting over the paddies that now lay bare and waiting for winter's sleep. Genjiro sat with Asa at the threshold of their small house, Taichi leaning against his shoulder. In his mind, he saw the hidden bundles and wondered if they might remain undisturbed until the snows came. He wondered if a man might carry both fear and hope in the same hand, and somehow not be crushed by their weight. Beside him, Asa pressed her palm to his. No words were needed. The wind stirred the drying stalks in the patties, carrying the faint promise that somewhere, deep beneath the frost-bound soil, life waited for spring's return. Patient, stubborn, and unseen. When winter at last came to Himorogi, it did not arrive as a storm, but as a slow tightening of breath. Frost first touched the edges of the patties, a lace of white that melted with the day's first weak sun. Then the winds turned sharper, slipping through the cracks in every plank of every house, rattling shutters that had long since forgotten how to close properly. By the time the first snow drifted down from the mountains, the villagers were ready, or as ready as peasants ever were to greet the season that asked more than it gave. Inside Genjiro's house, warmth came from a single hearth where embers burned low but steady. The family huddled close at night, their thin bedding made thicker by bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Asa rose before dawn each morning to coax the coals back to life, feeding the fire with twigs she and Taichi gathered at the forest's edge before the drifts grew too deep. Sometimes the wind's howl slipped under the door like a ghostly guest. Yet within those walls, life pressed on, small, stubborn, unwilling to be snuffed out. The hidden rice lay untouched, buried deep beneath reeds now stiff with frost. Each evening, Genjiro's thoughts drifted there, his mind measuring the days, counting each mouthful ladled into rough bowls. The official stores were nearly gone, taken by the steward's men weeks ago, leaving the villagers with scraps of millet and a few precious handfuls of dried vegetables. Yet Genjiro did not dare touch the hidden grain too soon. It must be saved for the nights when the wind would bite harder than hunger's growl. One such night, the wind rose fierce enough to bend the bamboo fence around their garden patch. Inside, the children lay wrapped together like kittens, breathing soft puffs of mist into the chill air. Genjiro sat with Asa by the hearth, a battered pot bubbling with thin barley gruel that smelled of nothing but warmth. They ate in silence at first, each spoonful a promise that tomorrow they would have just enough strength to gather more kindling, mend another sandal, patch another tear in a child's robe. After the meal, Asa leaned back against the wall, her eyes half closed. In the flicker of the hearth, her face looked younger, as if the lines of worry and toil had softened in the hush of the fire's glow. Genjiro watched her and wondered if she dreamed of spring, when the patties would wake again beneath the mountain's thaw. He reached for her hand, and she opened her eyes, offering him a weary smile that said more than words ever could. But outside their fragile bubble of warmth, the cold was not the only threat that winter carried. Word drifted into Himorogi that the steward's men would pass through once more before the snows grew too deep to travel. They came under the guise of inspection, a polite word for suspicion. They wished to ensure that no grain had been hidden, no bundles set aside for bellies that did not belong to the Lord. When the rumor reached Genjiro, his stomach clenched tighter than any hunger pang. He told Asa that night, speaking in a whisper, as if the very shadows might carry his secret to the magistrate's ears. Asa listened, stirring the pot though its contents were already gone. She did not flinch. Instead, she said they would do as they must. If the men came, they would bow low, speak soft words, offer what scraps they still held openly, and pray that no footprints led the soldiers to the reeds by the river bend. Days later, the inspection came. The men rode into Himorogi wrapped in heavy cloaks of fur and cloth, their horses' breath rising in clouds that matched the steam from every humble hearth they passed. The villagers gathered, teeth chattering not only from cold, but from the iron chill of fear. The leader of the band, a broad man with a voice like gravel, dragged across a frozen path, demanded entry to each house, eyes sharp as a blade's edge. Genjiro stood at his threshold, Taichi by his side, Asa behind them with the younger children tucked out of sight. When the men stepped inside, the house seemed to shrink, its poor walls no match for the cold metal at their belts, the rough leather of their boots trampling the fragile space that was home. They poked through the rice jars, turned over baskets, lifted mats, and tapped at the floor as if half expecting treasure to spill out. They found nothing but dust and old straw. When they left, Genjiro's legs nearly gave way beneath him. Asa caught his arm, steadying him with a touch as light as the drifting snow outside. That night, they sat by the hearth again, But this time, the gruel tasted sweeter than any feast, because it meant they still had enough hidden away to see the moon's full cycle one more time. Taichi asked if the men would come back, his young face pinched with the sort of worry no child should wear. Genjiro told him they would not until spring at least, and that was truth enough for now. In the days that followed, the snow deepened its hold on Himorogi. Smoke rose thinly from each thatched roof, a fragile signal that life endured within. The children's laughter, though softer than in the green seasons, still rose sometimes above the wind's keen whistle, small voices that proved hunger had not yet claimed their joy. And beneath the reeds by the river bend, the hidden rice waited, a promise wrapped in cloth and silence, guarding the peasants of Himorogi through the longest nights winter could offer. When the New Year's first thaw came, it arrived as a hush rather than a fanfare. Snow melted slowly, leaving behind rivulets that traced their way through the fields like pale veins awakening the cold earth. In Himorogi, the villagers emerged from their homes blinking at the pale sun, as if unsure it would truly stay. They moved stiffly after so many weeks spent crouched by the hearth, every joint and muscle stiff from stillness, and the strain of hunger held at bay by the hidden rice that, by some quiet miracle, remained undiscovered. Genjiro and Asa were among the first to stand at the edge of their paddy, gazing at the brown earth that lay beneath the last thin crusts of frost. It was hard to imagine it would soon be flooded and alive again, green shoots quivering under the spring wind. Taichi stood beside them, taller than before, the angles of boyhood beginning to lengthen into the lines of youth. His eyes, once quick with simple questions, now held the slow, steady worry of someone who understood too early how thin the thread of survival could be. One cold morning, Genjiro took Taichi with him to the river bend. There, beneath the reeds, still bowing under patches of frost, they unearthed what remained of the hidden rice. It was less than it had been, rationed carefully through the darkest nights, pinched grain by grain into meals so that none would faint in the fields come spring. They opened the bundles slowly, fingers numb but reverent. Taichi ran his hands over the cloth as if it were silk, though inside lay nothing but rough stalks and polished grains, precious beyond any coin. Genjiro showed his son how to lift the rice gently, how to wrap it tight again to keep the damp from spoiling what little was left. They would save the final portion for the days when the new seedlings must be planted and bodies needed strength to stand knee-deep in the flooded fields from dawn until dusk. Taichi asked why they had hidden it, voice low as the reeds whispered around them. Genjiro hesitated. Then he told his son what he could, that sometimes the world asked a man to bend so far he nearly broke, and a hidden handful of rice could be the difference between bowing and shattering. Back at the house, Asa prepared what remained of the winter roots, adding a thin handful of rice to the pot as if it were a king's ransom. She stirred slowly, her hands red from the icy water she had drawn from the well at dawn. Beside her, the younger children played with sticks and scraps of straw, weaving tiny dolls and animals. Even as their ribs pressed sharp beneath their thin robes, they laughed at their small creations, giving them names and voices that chased away the memory of growling stomachs. That night, when the meal was finished and the fire burned low, Genjiro and Asa spoke of what lay ahead. The steward's men would come soon to count heads and measure fields, to remind the village that their duty to the Lord did not rest simply because the soil did. Rumors swirled already. New levies for repairs to the Lord's castle, whispers of distant conflicts that meant more grain and more men might be demanded in the coming seasons. These rumors clung to the villagers' shoulders like an invisible yoke, heavier than the baskets they would soon carry to the paddies. Hachiro came to Genjiro's door one evening, stamping snow from his sandals, eyes bright in the dim glow of the single lantern that flickered near the door. He spoke in a hush of how some villagers were gathering to talk in secret, of sharing tools and seed grain, of watching the steward's men and sending word if they came too often or asked too much. Not rebellion, never that word, but a promise that if one family faltered, the others would lift them before they slipped beneath the weight. Genjiro listened, arms crossed as the wind hissed through the gaps in the door. He said little. But when Hachiro left, Asa looked at him and asked if he would stand with the others when the time came. Genjiro did not answer directly. He only said that no one field could feed a village alone, and no one family could stand alone when the storms rose. Asa nodded once, her eyes reflecting the low flame between them. The days lengthened by mere heartbeats, but the villagers felt each moment of light like a blessing. On clear mornings, women carried baskets to the edge of the thawing paddies to pick the first tender shoots of wild greens, their breath curling into the cold air. Children chased each other through patches of muddy snow, laughing as if they did not know how close hunger had come to pressing its palm fully over their mouths. One evening, Taichi sat with his father outside the house. They watched the moon rise, a thin sickle of silver, the first clear sign that winter's hold was loosening its grip. Taichi asked what they would do if next winter came too soon, or if the steward's men took more than they could give. Genjiro placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the bones beneath his thin robe, and said that when a man cannot stand, he leans. When a village cannot stand, it leans together. And sometimes, when enough backs lean together, they find they have become a wall no steward can push through. In the hush that followed, the fields lay sleeping, waiting for the rain, for the flooding, for the slow, stubborn green to rise once more. And the people of Himorogi, too, waited. Thin and tired, yes, but unbowed beneath the bright, brittle stars of early spring. When spring finally settled its damp fingers into the soil of Himorogi, it came not as a burst of color, but as a patient thawing, mud replacing frost, water seeping into furrows left ragged by winter's breath. The paddies, so recently bare and brittle beneath thin snow, now drank deeply of meltwater trickling from the wooded hills. And with this quiet awakening, the village stirred, shoulders bent once more toward another season's promise and burden. Genjiro rose each morning while the mist still clung to the reeds and the distant crows called out their hoarse greetings to the new day. Taichi came with him now without needing to be woken, his limbs lean and awkward in the last stretch between boy and youth. Together, father and son stood at the edge of their paddy, water pooled at their feet, the thin sheen of reflected sky, broken by the first careful thrusts of rice seedlings they had nursed in sheltered beds near the house. Planting season was backbreaking, knees pressed deep into the cold, wet mud, spines bent until the world narrowed to nothing but the rows ahead, and the steady rhythm of hands sinking seedlings into place. Genjiro remembered being no older than Taichi when his own father taught him the same silent lessons. How deep to press each stalk, how to space them so the water flowed just so, how to listen for the faint tremor in the wind that warned of a sudden change in weather. He could still see his father's broad back in his mind, stooped like a hill beneath rain and sun alike. Asa worked nearby, sleeves tied high, her feet bare in the paddies, though the water still bit with the chill left by mountain snow. She moved with a quiet grace, her fingers quick and sure, her eyes drifting often to the edge of the field, where the younger children played at building canals in the mud. Their laughter mixed with the croak of frogs waking to the warming days, a fragile chorus that made even the hardest work bearable. Each evening, when the light grew soft and gold over the paddies, the villagers gathered by the shrine to Inari. There, offerings of rice cakes, thin and precious, were left in thanks for the season's mercy, for the promise of enough water, enough sun, enough to keep their bowls from echoing empty when winter turned its eye back upon them. Hachiro often stood with Genjiro during these offerings, speaking in murmurs of how the steward's men would surely come again before the harvest was done, how they would weigh not only the rice, but the villagers' resolve. In these hushed talks, ideas were passed like secret seeds, the possibility of a watch set at the forest's edge, quiet signals, if the steward's men arrived early, plans for families to share what little they could spare if one house's stores ran dry too soon. It was not rebellion, never that dangerous word, but a weaving together of backs and shoulders, a promise that the cracks in one man's wall might be mended by the stones of his neighbor. One night, when the moon hung round and pale above the paddies, Genjiro and Asa sat outside their house after the children had drifted to sleep. They spoke of these quiet talks, of the risk that clung like mist around every whispered plan. Asa's hands were raw from the cold water and the rough stalks, but she held Genjiro's without complaint, her thumb tracing the old calluses on his palm. She told him that fear was a tool, sharp, dangerous, but sometimes the only blade left to carve out a sliver of safety. Taichi, half feigning sleep within the house, listened through the thin paper wall. He understood more now than either of his parents realized. How the steward's ledgers left no room for mercy, how a single missing bundle of rice could mean lashes or worse. And yet, hearing his parents speak in low, steady voices, he felt something like pride press against the worry in his chest. If they could stand so quietly against the weight that pressed them down, then perhaps he could too. As spring deepened, the rains came, gentle at first, then sudden and fierce, filling the paddies until the water shimmered under restless clouds. The villagers worked through the downpours, sleeves soaked through, hair slicked to their foreheads, feet sunk deep in the soft, shifting earth. At night, they returned home caked in mud, skin aching, yet grateful for the water that meant life for the seedlings. Each drop was a coin against future hunger, a promise that the hidden rice would not need to stretch so thin again when the snow returned. Still, rumors drifted down from travelers and passing monks, of unrest in distant domains, of wars brewing beyond the mountains that would demand more rice, more men, more sacrifice. The village elders spoke in tight knots beneath the shrine's torii gate, voices muffled by rain and the hiss of wind through the bamboo. Genjiro listened when he could, weighed each word like a grain in the palm, testing its worth. One dusk, when the sky glowed the color of embers and frogs sang so loudly they nearly drowned out human voices, Hachiro came to Genjiro's house. He brought with him a small bundle of seed rice, more than he could spare, truth be told, and pressed it into Genjiro's hands without a word. A gift, but more than that, a thread binding neighbor to neighbor, a quiet promise that in the seasons to come, no one would stand alone on the muddy banks of the paddies. And so, beneath the heavy spring sky, as water pooled and frogs called out the night's secrets, the villagers of Himorogi pressed on, backs bent, eyes watchful, hands stained by soil and silence alike. They did not speak of rebellion. They did not dare dream of freedom. They spoke only of the harvest to come, and in their hearts they planted something deeper than rice, something that waited, patient and hidden, for the day it might rise tall and stubborn against the storms. As spring slowly yielded to the first heat of early summer, the paddies of Himorogi transformed into broad mirrors that caught the sky in their shallow waters. The rice grew taller by the week, slender green blades shivering in the breeze, whispering secrets only the wind understood. The air turned heavy with the scent of wet earth and the low hum of insects, their chorus weaving through the days and settling deep into the villagers, bones like a chant of life persisting against all odds. For Genjiro and his family, the days now blurred into one long stretch of labor. Each dawn, the village stirred before the sun rose fully, shadows of men and women moving through the mist to tend the paddies. Weeds had to be pulled before they could choke the rice. Dikes and channels had to be mended where the water threatened to spill away into thirsty soil. Every handful of rice come harvest depended on this quiet war fought daily against creeping vines and leaking banks. Taichi had grown strong in this season of mud and water. His shoulders, still narrow, carried more than his age should have demanded. Bundles of weeds slung over his back, baskets of stones to shore up the embankments. He worked beside Genjiro without complaint, though at night Asa sometimes found his thin arms trembling as he drifted to sleep. She would press her palm against his brow, smoothing away the lines that worry and work had carved too soon. One humid afternoon, Genjiro paused at the edge of the field to watch Taichi working. The boy was knee-deep in water, sleeves rolled high, hair plastered to his forehead. Beyond him, a dragonfly skimmed low, its wings flickering like a tiny lantern in the heat haze. Genjiro felt a swell of pride mixed with an ache that never quite left his chest, a wish that his son might know more than this unending toil, this careful dance to keep starvation at bay. Yet there was little time for dreams. Word came that the steward's men would pass through again, this time to measure the progress of the paddies. Their visits had grown more frequent, as if they suspected that each handful of hidden rice had somehow multiplied in secret shadows. The villagers spoke of it in low voices while they worked, glancing at the ridge where the forest met the fields, wondering from which bend of the road the horses would appear. Hachiro came to Genjiro's house one evening as the cicadas began their sharp song. He brought a jug of weak plum wine, more for the excuse to speak freely than for any real pleasure it could offer. They sat at the threshold while Asa tended a pot of simmering greens behind them, the smell drifting out into the thick summer dusk. Hachiro's voice was gruff with worry. He spoke of another village downriver, one that had hidden too much. The steward's men had found the hidden store, and in the finding, they had taken more than rice, beatings, a house set to flame, a family fled into the woods. Genjiro listened in silence, the jug heavy in his hands. They both knew that the lines they walked were thin as a reed in the river's current. Asa joined them for a moment, folding herself beside Genjiro. She did not flinch at Hachiro's story. She only asked what would be done now. Hachiro shrugged, broad shoulders rising like hills against the dusk. "We watch," he said. "We warn each other. We stand close, like stones in a wall." The next morning, the village rose to news that a peddler had seen the steward's men camped 2 ridges away. A thin tremor passed through Himorogi as the word spread. Mothers tying their children's sleeves tighter, men reinforcing storage sheds to look empty of anything worth hiding. Genjiro joined a handful of neighbors at the shrine to Inari, standing beneath the fox statues streaked dark with moss. They spoke in whispers of how to greet the men, how to answer questions without answers, how to bow deeply enough to hide the raw edge of fear in their eyes. When the sun broke through the clouds that day, it felt too bright, too sharp on their bent backs. Genjiro returned to his paddy and found Taichi there already, balancing carefully along the narrow bank, chasing frogs away from the seedlings. When Genjiro called to him, the boy turned with a smile so quick it caught in Genjiro's throat. For a moment, he let himself imagine a world where that smile could last all season, unshadowed by men in armor and ledgers filled with cruel sums. By evening, the first distant sound of hooves on the main path reached the village. Asa called the children inside, whispering for them to stay near. Genjiro washed his arms in the shallow channel beside the paddy, watching the water swirl away mud and sweat, as if it could wash away the dread that settled deeper than any grime. When he stepped back into the house, Asa met him with her steady eyes. No words passed between them. There was nothing left to say. Together, they sat close by the hearth, the children pressed to their sides, listening to the low rumble of approaching voices and the clink of metal that promised yet again that peace for peasants was always as thin and fleeting as the water in the paddies that held their hope afloat. The steward's men arrived in Himorogi as the last light of day clung stubbornly to the ridge tops. They came with little ceremony, but their presence carried all the weight of iron. Horses snorted at the edge of the paddies, stamping hooves into the muddy track. A few soldiers dismounted, leading the animals to drink from the irrigation channels where children sometimes played in gentler seasons. Tonight, no child dared draw near. Genjiro stood with the other men of the village at the narrow road's bend, backs bowed as the leader. A broad man named Kondo, whose voice was as flat as the coins he counted, unrolled a list from within his lacquered sleeve. The names were read aloud in the hush of dusk, each syllable landing like a pebble dropped into deep water. When Genjiro's name came, he stepped forward, eyes down, hands folded over the front of his robe. Behind him, Taichi watched from the shadows, where Asa pressed him back with a firm hand. The boy's breath came quick and shallow. He was old enough now to understand that the wrong word, the wrong glance, might cost more than rice. Kondo spoke briskly of new levies. The castle's repairs, it seemed, had grown more costly than expected. More rice would be needed this season, not only from Himorogi, but from every paddy within the Lord's reach. The words settled on the villagers like a fresh snowfall, silent at first, then heavy enough to bow shoulders already bent near to breaking. Genjiro kept his gaze on the packed earth between his feet. He murmured the proper replies. "Yes, honorable sir. We live to serve. The harvest will be bountiful." Words smooth as river stones, polished by generations of need. When Kondo stepped closer, his boots leaving dark prints in the wet soil, Genjiro felt Taichi's eyes on him from the shadows. He did not lift his own. Inspections began before the moon rose high. Soldiers moved through each house, their sandals scraping against wooden floors, blades at their hips rattling softly in the close air. They overturned baskets, prodded beneath sleeping mats, opened jars that held nothing but millet husks and stale pickles. In Genjiro's house, Asa stood with her children behind her like a low wall of straw and bone. One soldier tipped a storage jar on its side and watched with narrowed eyes as a handful of rice grains scattered onto the floor, precious crumbs that Asa would later sweep up and save. When at last the men left, the village did not breathe easy. Instead, small knots of neighbors gathered in the darkness, heads close, voices barely above the frogs calling from the water's edge. Genjiro lingered by the corner of his house, listening as Hachiro spoke in low, clipped tones. The steward's demands were impossible. More than the patties could yield, more than the families could spare, and still survive the next lean winter. Some spoke of sending word to distant cousins, of begging grain from wealthier villages upriver. Others fell silent, turning their eyes to the hills as if they hid an escape that none dared name. Inside, Asa busied herself sweeping up the scattered rice. She moved slowly, careful not to miss a single grain. Taichi watched her, the question trembling on his lips. What happens when there is nothing left to hide? But the words stayed caught in his throat. Instead, he crouched beside her, gathering stray grains in his small palm until together they had enough to sprinkle back into the pot. That night, Genjiro did not sleep. He sat outside the house, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and the hush of the patties beyond. Hachiro came again in the dead hours, his broad shadow settling beside Genjiro like a boulder in the dark. He spoke of a plan, nothing grand, nothing that would draw steel or fire. Only this, that when the time came, they would hold back a little more, share a little more, move quickly if rumor came of soldiers on the path. A man alone breaks, Hachiro said, voice low as the rustle of reeds. But if we lean into each other, like the bamboo grove by the shrine, maybe we bend instead. Genjiro nodded, though the fear in his belly twisted like a knotted rope. He thought of Taichi's thin shoulders, of Asa's quiet resolve, of the reeds by the river that had hidden their secret through the worst of winter. He thought, too, of Kondo's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, patient as hunger. Before dawn, Genjiro rose and walked to the edge of the patties. He dipped his hands into the cold, clear water, feeling it slip through his fingers as easily as a promise. The rice stalks stood thin and green under the paling stars, trembling at the breath of wind from the hills. He whispered a prayer. No words for distant gods in gilded shrines, only a humble plea to the restless spirits of field and water. Let the stalks grow tall. Let the soil hold strong. Let the hidden be enough. And as the sky broke into the pale gray of another day, Genjiro turned back toward the house where Asa and the children still slept. He knew that what came next would demand more than quiet hope. It would demand hands steady enough to plant truth among lies, voices calm enough to say the right things when swords waited in silence. It would demand that the people of Himorogi stand like the bamboo grove, rooted together, bending when the storm came, but refusing, as best they could, to break. Through the hush of dawn's whispering, as the mist draped itself gently upon the narrow patties and the crooked roofs of humble dwellings, the peasants of Aomori province stirred from slumber like weary ghosts summoned by obligation rather than desire. In this land, where the winters bit harder than the taxes and the soil seemed to drink more sweat than rain, life crawled forward under the watchful gaze of lords whose banners fluttered high above hardship and hunger alike. Among these peasants was old Ichiro, whose back had become a map of toil, curved hills of muscle strained and worn, valleys of pain that deepened with each planting season. Ichiro's children, though yet untouched by age's cruelty, bore in their eyes the knowing resignation that this cycle, plant, bow, bend, break, was their inheritance more surely than any parcel of rice field could be. They rose before the sun bled gold onto the mist and crept to the patties barefoot, so the soft mud could welcome their steps like an old friend. In these last weeks before harvest, every hand, whether young, gnarled, or trembling, found its place in the vast green sea of rice stalks. Fingers plucked weeds with silent care, lest the Lord's appointed steward find a patch neglected. For a weed in a noble's field was an insult graver than hunger in a peasant's belly. And so Ichiro's wife Hana worked with her sleeves tied back, the delicate skin of her wrists flecked with mud and bitten by small cuts from stray reeds. She hummed under her breath a song her mother once sang, a lullaby that drifted now not to cradle children, but to hold her own spirit steady. Her oldest daughter, Aiko, labored beside her, dark hair tied with a strip of faded cloth, eyes fixed on the rose yet to be tended. The girl's back already bore the stoop of those who never look up at the sky for long, though the days blurred into one another, a tapestry of dawns and dusks stitched by endless bending. This particular morning brought a tremor of unease that hummed through the village like a distant drum. Word had passed from mouth to ear that the daimyo's men would ride through today, counting the yields, measuring how much the people owed for the privilege of working land that would never be theirs. Ichiro felt the weight of this knowledge in his bones as he paused to straighten his back, one hand pressed to the small of it. His breath rose in thin white threads that faded into the cool morning. He knew that no matter how fat the stalks grew, it would never be enough. The Lord's granary must swell first. Only then would a few grains trickle down to keep the peasants alive for another season. He cast his gaze toward the village path, where hoofprints still fresh from yesterday's messengers marred the muddy road. A line of children, little more than shadows in the mist, were sent to watch for the retinue. They would run back breathless, cheeks flushed, warning the village to smooth its face, to hide its ragged edges, to pretend that all was as it should be. Behind Ichiro, the thatched roofs of the village hunched together like old men whispering secrets. Beneath those roofs, winter stores were counted over and over by lantern light, mothers calculating how many mouths could be fed if the Lord's levy left them with too little. Small hands clutched bowls half filled with thin gruel, children blowing on the steam, savoring each swallow as if it were the sweetest broth in the empire. By midday, the sun burned away the mist, revealing the full drudgery of the fields, rows that rippled green and gold, stretching far yet never far enough to promise plenty. Ichiro's feet sank deeper into the muck as he stepped from one row to another, his mind drifting to the winter to come. In these northern reaches, snow did not merely blanket the earth, but smothered it, sealing away any chance of foraging or hunting. What little rice they hid away in secret corners would have to last until spring's first thaw. Hana glanced at her husband, seeing his silence wrap around him like a second garment. She wanted to speak of small things, how Aiko's hands had grown nimble, how their youngest, Kenta, had caught a sparrow with his bare hands yesterday, a tiny promise of meat for the evening stew. But the words died in her mouth when a faint thunder rose behind the hills, the unmistakable cadence of hooves drumming the earth in perfect, merciless rhythm. The children who had kept watch scrambled back into the fields, their cries weaving through the stalks. "They're coming! They're coming!" The villagers straightened their backs despite the ache, wiped sweat from brows, and summoned smiles that reached only halfway to their eyes. First came the banners, snapping in the breeze, bold splashes of color against the tame green of the paddies. Then the men, armored retainers on well-fed horses, their faces hidden behind lacquered masks that turned them into something more than men, less than gods. Between them rode the steward, a thin man with sharp eyes, his kimono bright unsoiled by the earth he ruled from afar. He raised a hand, and the line of peasants fell to their knees like stalks before the scythe. Ichiro felt his old joints protest as they pressed into the mud. He kept his head low, hoping his children did the same. The steward's gaze swept over them, counting not the people but the yield behind them. The worth of each bowed back. He spoke little, for words were wasted on those who could not answer back. His assistant scribbled marks on parchment, eyes flicking between the fields and the kneeling villagers. Now and then, a retainer dismounted to inspect the rice up close, plucking grains and letting them fall through armored fingers, as if sifting for hidden gold. Ichiro's breath caught when the steward's shadow fell over him. He could feel Hana's trembling beside him, heard Aiko's small gasp when the steward's eyes lingered on her face a heartbeat too long. But the man moved on, his interest not in their stories, their fears, or their names, but in the yield that would feed men who had never touched mud with bare hands. When at last the retinue departed, trailing banners and cold judgment behind, the village remained on its knees a moment longer, as if the earth itself demanded their obeisance. Then, slowly, they rose, bodies stiff, hope thinner than the wind threading through the paddies. Ichiro met Hana's eyes and found there no comfort, only the unspoken truth. There would be less this winter, as always. Less rice, less warmth, less strength for the planting that would come again when the snows melted and life, stubborn and brutal, demanded the same from them once more. As dusk fell and the paddies grew quiet, the people returned to their huts, carrying the day's silence with them. In the darkness, small flames flickered in hearts that burned more hope than wood. Children pressed close to mothers, listening not to lullabies, but to the scraping of bowls, the counting of sacks hidden beneath floorboards. And above it all, the moon rose over the thatched roofs, pale and watchful, casting its indifferent glow upon peasants who dreamed not of freedom or fortune, but merely of waking tomorrow with enough strength to bend once more. In the hush that settled after the steward's passing, a brittle quiet took root in the village, like frost spreading across a window pane, delicate yet unforgiving. Night had come, and within each small hut, the peasants gathered around low hearths that sighed out thin ribbons of warmth. The walls, made of wattle and daub, could not keep out the chill that crept through the rice straw mats, nor could they hush the empty murmurs of stomachs that had been asked to give more than they could bear. Inside Ichiro's dwelling, the flicker of a single oil lamp painted long shadows across the faces of his family. Aiko sat closest to the flame, her small hands cupped around a bowl of watery broth, savoring each sip as if it were a banquet. Beside her, Kenta, too young yet to understand the full cruelty of the levy, leaned into his mother's side, eyelids fluttering heavy with sleep. Hana ran her fingers through his hair, her touch gentle as drifting snow. Ichiro, seated cross-legged upon the reed mat, stared into the embers that glowed within their clay hearth. His mind wandered to the steward's passing glance, the way the man's eyes had stripped the village bare, leaving only yield and tribute in his wake. He wondered how much longer he could offer his back to the Lord's fields before it broke for good. What then would become of Hana, of Aiko, of Kenta? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bamboo fence that marked the boundary of their meager plot. Beyond that fence lay the paddies, sleeping now beneath the watchful moon, yet waiting to rise hungry again at dawn. For the land was never sated. It demanded care through every season, its greed rivaling that of any daimyo's purse. Aiko's voice, soft and cautious, broke through Ichiro's thoughts. "Father, will the steward return soon?" The question hovered in the smoky air, fragile as a moth's wing. Ichiro lifted his gaze to his daughter, taking in her thin shoulders, her eyes bright yet edged with shadows too old for her years. "Not until after the harvest," he murmured, his voice a rough whisper shaped by years of sun and soil. "He will come to collect what we owe." "And if there is not enough?" she asked, though she already knew. They all did. Hana's hand stilled in Kenta's hair, and the boy stirred, murmuring a wordless dream. Ichiro let out a sigh that felt heavier than any sack of rice he had ever carried. "Then we must find enough," he said at last, "even if it costs us more than rice." He did not speak of what that might mean, of the borrowed coin from the village elder, of the favors traded in hushed corners, of the hidden debts that twisted through the peasant community like roots beneath the paddies. These were truths too bitter for Aiko's young ears, yet truths she would one day inherit as surely as the fields themselves. Hana rose and ladled the last of the broth into Ichiro's bowl. She pressed it into his hands with a look that said she knew he would refuse it if she did not insist. He drank it slowly, letting the warmth chase away a little of the night's creeping cold. Each swallow tasted of sacrifice, a reminder that every mouthful given to him was one less for the children. When the meal was done, the family lay upon straw mats spread side by side across the earthen floor. Hana curled around Kenta, humming a tune that once might have been a lullaby, but now served only to hush his restless sleep. Aiko turned toward the wall, her small back to the room, though Ichiro knew her eyes were open long after they should have closed. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the sigh of the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. His mind drifted to the stories he had heard as a boy, tales of ronin who wandered the provinces, blades at their hip, living free of any master's claim. He imagined himself in their place, his back unbowed, his labor his own. But such dreams were the province of poets and fools, not of men whose hands were thick with calluses, whose lives were bound to rice stalks and lords' taxes. When at last sleep took him, it came as it always did, like a thief at the door, stealing hours rather than granting rest. He dreamed of the fields, of standing knee-deep in the paddies as the water rose higher and higher, pressing against his chest, then his throat. In the dream, he could hear the steward's voice, carried on the wind, reciting debts like prayers while Ichiro's feet sank deeper into the muck. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the memory of water clinging to his skin though the hearth had long since cooled to ash. Beside him, Hana slept with Kenta's small form nestled in the curve of her arm. Aiko's quiet breathing came from the far mat, steady but shallow. Ichiro sat up, feeling the ache in his spine, the stiffness in his shoulders, each joint a tally of years spent bending to someone else's hunger. Outside, the first hush of pre-dawn crept through the village. Somewhere, a rooster cried out, its voice a thin herald of another day that promised no mercy. Ichiro rose and stepped outside into the chill. He crossed the yard to the shed, where tools leaned against the walls like old comrades. He ran his hand over the worn wooden handles, feeling the groove his fingers had carved into them over countless seasons. In the distance, other doors creaked open. Other fathers, other sons, stepping into the cold with shoulders squared against the weight of dawn. They moved through the mist like wraiths, each to his own corner of the fields, bound together by the silent promise that as long as they bent, as long as they toiled, the village would endure another winter. And so Ichiro lifted his hoe, its blade dull but dependable, and walked to the paddies where the earth waited. The mud welcomed his feet like an old friend, cold, clinging, relentless. He looked up at the paling sky where the last stars faded behind drifting clouds, and he whispered a wordless prayer, not for freedom, but for strength enough to bend without breaking, for another day to rise and fall, and for his children's dreams to carry them beyond these fields he could never leave. Morning crept into the village on pale feet, brushing aside the tatters of mist that clung to the paddies and the crooked roofs. The thin sunlight did little to warm the air, yet the peasants welcomed its coming all the same, for it marked the beginning of another chance to stand, to bend, to endure. Along the narrow paths that wound between huts and fields, soft murmurs rose with the smoke from breakfast fires. Families sharing a single bowl of rice, mothers coaxing children into rough-spun garments, patched and repatched until the cloth seemed more stitched than fabric. Ichiro's family was among them, gathered once more around the shallow hearth. Hana worked quietly, her hands deft as she ladled a thin porridge into small wooden bowls. The scent was plain, boiled rice, a whisper of dried herbs from last summer's garden. There was no fish, no meat, yet the children ate slowly, prolonging the warmth in their bellies, as if to trick hunger into forgetting them. Aiko watched her mother's hands, memorizing each small motion, the way Hana tapped the ladle's edge on the pot to shake loose the last drops, how she wiped the rim with a careful swipe of her sleeve. In these small gestures lay lessons that no temple or tutor could offer. How to stretch a harvest that was never enough, how to hide fear behind soft words and steady hands. Outside, Ichiro waited by the door, his hoe resting against his shoulder. He peered toward the horizon, where the paddies glimmered faintly under the new sun. A chill wind ruffled the edge of his straw hat. Today, they would check the buns that cradled the flooded fields, thin ridges of earth that must be tended with care, lest a leak drain away a season's hope in a single night. Beside him, Kenta tugged at his father's sleeve, small eyes bright despite the meager meal. "Father," the boy asked, voice muffled by the chill, "will we see the cranes today?" Ichiro turned to him, a ghost of a smile softening the hard lines of his face. "Perhaps, little one. If we are quiet enough, we may catch their wings in the paddies." He ruffled Kenta's hair, a gesture that spoke of love deeper than words. A crane in the fields was a sign of good fortune, folk said, though Ichiro wondered, not for the first time, whether fortune had forgotten the peasants of this land altogether. They set out together, father, son, and behind them Aiko and Hana, their steps soft along the packed dirt paths. Each villager they passed dipped their heads in silent greeting. Words were few in the early hours. The work would speak for them soon enough. Beyond the village edge, the paddies stretched wide and patient, veined with channels of still water that reflected the pale blue of the sky. Ichiro sank into the mud with a sigh that seemed to drift from his very bones. He waded through the rows, testing the strength of the buns with his foot, pressing the heel of his hoe into weak spots to pack the clay tighter. Kenta followed close behind, trying to place his small feet in his father's prints. Now and then, Aiko bent low to tug free a stubborn weed that threatened the rice stalk's fragile dominion. Hana worked apart from them, kneeling in the shallows where the paddies met a narrow stream. She gathered reeds for patching the thatch back home, her hands red from the cold water. As she worked, her thoughts wandered to the bundles of rice hidden beneath their floorboards, to the coins tucked away in a folded cloth near the hearth, too few to see them through the winter, yet precious enough that she checked their hiding place each night before sleep. Overhead, the morning sky slowly gathered warmth, and a hush of wings stirred the air. Kenta froze, his eyes wide as he pointed toward the far edge of the paddy. There, in the shallows, a lone crane stood, its long neck curved like a brushstroke against the brightening sky. Its feathers shimmered with ghostly silver, and for a breathless moment, time seemed to slow. Even Ichiro paused, leaning on his hoe, letting the sight sink into the weary places of his heart. Aiko crept closer, steps careful on the muddy ridge. She had heard the old women speak of cranes, how they carried souls to the heavens, how they brought blessings to those who watched in silence. She wished, silently, fiercely, that the crane would leave behind some scrap of luck for her family, that the simple grace of its wings might lift them above the hunger waiting just beyond the winter's edge. But as suddenly as it had appeared, the crane lifted its head, gave a single soft cry, and rose into the air. Its wings beat slow and wide, scattering droplets of water that sparkled like fleeting stars. Kenta's laughter rang out, bright and brief, as the bird vanished into the distance. Ichiro watched it go, his smile lingering only a moment before the weight of the day settled back upon his shoulders. He turned to his children, brushing a fleck of mud from Kenta's cheek. "Come," he said. "The buns won't mend themselves." And so they worked. The sun climbed higher, burning the mist away entirely, revealing the full, stark truth of the fields. The stalks still green but thinning in patches. The buns cracked in places where the cold had seeped in overnight. Each fault was a threat, a single breach that could spell ruin if left untended. As they labored, the village came alive around them. Other families moved through the paddies, calling softly to one another, sharing tools and news in voices hushed by the knowledge that their toil would never be their own. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere else, an old man's cough rattled the air. But between these sounds rose the steady rhythm of work, the slap of water, the squelch of feet in mud, the low hum of voices carrying old songs meant to bind one hour to the next. By late afternoon, Ichiro paused to straighten his back, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the lingering chill. Hana joined him then, carrying a small gourd of water that she pressed into his hands. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, for none were needed. In that look, they shared everything. Fear, hope, the simple, stubborn will to see tomorrow come. Together, they turned back to the paddies. Beyond them, the horizon shimmered with the promise of dusk. The crane was gone, its blessing uncertain, yet still they bent once more to the earth, driven by the same quiet faith that tomorrow somehow they would stand and bend again. Dusk came gently to the village, draping the paddies in a hush of deepening blue and silver. The air turned sharp as the last warmth fled with the sun, leaving behind only the low murmur of water trickling through the channels and the soft calls of returning farmers. From the thatched huts, thin ribbons of smoke rose to meet the first stars, small beacons that promised at least a meager supper to chase away the cold. Ichiro stood alone for a moment on the narrow ridge between rows of rice, his feet sunk deep into the mud that had claimed his strength hour after hour. Around him, the stalks swayed in the faint breath of evening wind, their slender leaves whispering secrets to the night. He listened, as he always did when dusk gathered, listened for something more than the rustle of stalks, something that might speak of hope where none was owed. Behind him, Hana's voice floated through the shadows, calling softly for the children. Kenta came first, stumbling along the narrow path with his arms full of broken reeds he had gathered for the hearth. His small boots, tied together from scraps of old straw sandals, squelched in the mud, but he held his prize high like an offering. Aiko followed more slowly, one hand trailing over the tops of the rice, as if trying to memorize their feel before the frost took them. Her eyes were turned toward the low hills beyond the village, where dark trees formed a jagged border against the sky. She wondered, as she often did, what lay beyond. Whether there were places where the earth did not demand so much, where food did not run dry before spring's thaw. She had heard whispers from traveling monks and old peddlers, places where the soil was black and rich, where farmers owned the land they sowed. But those were tales for restless hearts, not for daughters bound to father's fields. At the doorway of their hut, Hana met them with outstretched arms, gathering her family close as if her touch alone could ward off the chill. Inside, the hearth was a low red glow, fed by scraps of reed and twigs too small for any other purpose. A pot hung over the flame, its thin broth bubbling in soft whispers. The scent was humble, barely enough to stir hunger, yet in that small room, it was a promise that no one would sleep on an empty stomach tonight. They ate in silence, each mouthful drawn slowly from the bowl, as if the act of swallowing too quickly might break the fragile magic that kept them together. Kenta leaned sleepily against Hana's side, eyes fluttering closed between spoonfuls. Aiko set her bowl down carefully and pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze drifting to the shadows flickering along the walls. Ichiro finished last. He scraped the bottom of the pot with his chopsticks, collecting every last grain of rice clinging to the sides. He did not speak of the steward, nor the harvest yet to come, nor the weight that pressed against his chest each time he looked at the shrinking bundles hidden beneath the floor. Instead, he watched the slow rise and fall of his children's breathing, and let that be enough. When the bowls were stacked away and the pot left to cool on the hearth's edge, Hana rose and dipped a rag into a basin of cold water. She wiped Kenta's face, her touch tender as snow falling on old wood. Then she brushed Aiko's hair, untangling knots formed by the wind and the day's labor. These small rituals, repeated night after night, were their own prayers, quiet vows that though the earth might claim their bodies, it would not yet claim the softness of their hearts. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the bamboo fence and bending the tall grasses that lined the paths. From somewhere far off came the low bark of a dog, the hoot of an owl perched watchful on the village shrine's eaves. The world seemed vast then, and the little hut no more than a candle flickering in a storm too wide to name. Ichiro lay down last, his body settling heavily onto the straw mat beside Hana and the children. The warmth of them pressed against his side, and for a time, he lay awake listening to the brittle hush that filled the space between their breaths. His mind wandered to the crane they had seen that morning, its wings cutting through the cold air, unbound by duty or hunger or the whims of men with swords and banners. He wondered what freedom might feel like. Not for himself, for his bones were too deep in the mud to ever lift him from it, but for Aiko, for Kenta. He wondered if the earth could ever be kind, if the harvest might one day belong to the hands that planted it. Such thoughts were dangerous, yet they drifted through his mind like smoke curling into the rafters, impossible to catch and just as impossible to banish. Beside him, Hana's breathing deepened into the soft rhythm of sleep. He reached for her hand, found it beneath the blanket, their fingers weaving together in a promise older than any levy or lord's decree. Through all the seasons, planting, harvest, frost, famine, they had knelt side by side, bent side by side, risen side by side. So it would be until the earth called them home. Outside, the night wrapped the village in its endless dark. Stars wheeled unseen behind drifting clouds, and somewhere far beyond the paddies, the crane's wings beat against the wind, carrying with it a whisper of what might be waiting when dawn came again. Another day to stand, another day to bend. And in that bending, a quiet, stubborn kind of hope that refused to die.